Welcome to Holoreads. Today's story explores love, doubt, and the quiet collapse of the human mind. In Devils Within Us, Sabahattin Ali reveals how fear, insecurity, and pride can slowly poison a relationship. This is not a story about evil from the outside, but the darkness we carry within. Now, listen carefully.
The Devil Within Us by Sabahattin Ali. 1. On the deck of the ferry departing from Kadikuri to the bridge at 11 o'clock in the morning, two young men sat side by side, talking. The one sitting on the seaside was a plumpish young man with light brown hair and a pale face. His brown, myopic eyes, which always seemed half-closed behind tortoise-shell glasses and moved slowly over objects, turned from time to time to his companion and to the sea stretching out on the left under the sun's rays. His straight, somewhat longish hair fell from under his hat, which was pushed back, covering his right eyebrow and part of his eyelid. He spoke very rapidly, and as he talked, his lips pursed slightly, giving his mouth a pleasant shape. His companion, on the other hand, was a small, thin young man with a pale face, whose arms moved constantly with nervous gestures and whose eyes shot sharp glances at everything. Neither of them looked more than 25 years old, and both were of medium height. The plump one was speaking without taking his eyes from the sea. If I hadn't held myself back, I would have burst out laughing. As the history professor lined up question after question, the girl got confused and kept turning her head as if looking for help from all sides. Since I knew she hadn't opened the notes even once, I said to myself, she's clearly been caught out. Then my eye happened to fall on Umit, sitting behind her. What do I see but him making signals to the professor with his eyebrows and eyes? He got what he wanted, too, my friend. The professor asked a few superficial things, answered them himself, and passed the girl. Is he very taken with Umit? He's taken with every girl, as long as she's somewhat worth looking at. Then, striking his hand on his companion's knee, as if continuing his story, he said, "Life bores me. Everything bores me. School, professors, lessons, classmates, especially the girls. They all bore me, to the point of making me sick." He paused for a while. He fiddled with his glasses and continued. "I don't want anything. Nothing seems attractive to me. I feel myself growing more apathetic day by day, and I'm pleased about it. Perhaps after a while I'll fall into such a great lassitude that I won't even be able to feel boredom. A person should do something that, or else do nothing at all. I think, what can we do? Nothing. In a world millions of years old, the oldest thing is 20,000 years old. Even that's a somewhat exaggerated figure. The other day I was talking with our philosophy teacher. I broached the subject quite seriously and tried to investigate the reason for our existence. He couldn't answer the question of what the hell we came into the world for either. He went on about the pleasure of creating, the truth that life in itself is a wisdom, but it's all rotten. What are you going to create? To create is to make something out of nothing. Even the cleverest mind among us can't go beyond being a warehouse of a lot of knowledge and experience stored up by those before us. What we want to create amounts to nothing more than changing the form of these existing goods and putting them on the market. I don't know how this ridiculous business can satisfy a person. When there are stars whose light takes 5,000 years to reach us, trying to be immortal by writing works that, at best, will rot in libraries 50 years later, and whose author's name will finally be forgotten 500 years hence, or spending one's life kneading clay and chipping at marble so that 3,000 years later one's armless, legless statue will be exhibited in a museum. None of this seems to me like very sensible work." He murmured slowly, giving his voice a solemn air. "It seems to me there's only one thing we can really do, and that's to die.
Look, this we can do, and only then will we have used our will to accomplish something complete. You'll ask why I don't do this thing. I told you just now, I'm in a terrible state of lethargy. I'm too lazy. By the law of inertia, I'm just drifting along. Ah! He opened his mouth terribly wide and yawned. He stretched out his legs. An elderly man sitting across from them, reading an Armenian newspaper, immediately drew himself in at this expansion and shot a cross look at the young man. His companion hadn't paid much attention to all these words, perhaps because he was hearing them the 10th time. He had continued to let his eyes wander about and to mutter from time to time, frowning as if trying to gather certain thoughts in his head. When the one beside him finished his speech, he said with a meaningful smile, "Omer, do you have any money? Let's have a raka this evening." Omer, with a knowing manner, quite unsuited to his deep words of a moment ago, answered, "No, but we'll fleece someone. It would have been easy if I'd stopped by the office today, but I have no intention of doing that." The thin young man shook his head with an air of importance. "Omer, they'll sack you soon. Is it right to skip work this much? Besides, all the offices are looking for excuses to throw out clerks who attend the university. The situation of people like you who work at the post office is even worse. Time is more expensive there than anywhere else, or it should be." Then he added, laughing, "No wonder the letters we send from Beyazit arrive at Eminönü in 48 hours. Long live diligent clerks like you." Omer answered quite calmly, "I have nothing to do with letters. I'm in accounting. I fill ledgers until evening, and in the evenings sometimes I help the cashier. Counting money is a sweet thing, Nihat dear." Nihat, as if suddenly coming to life, said, "Interesting thing. Money is an interesting thing anyway, generally speaking. Very often I take a lira from my pocket, put it in front of me, and gaze at it for hours. There's nothing extraordinary about it, a lot of skillful lines, just like the geometric drawing assignments at school, perhaps a bit finer and more complicated. Then a picture, a few lines of abbreviated writing, and a signature or two. If you lean over it a bit too much, a heavy smell of grease and dirt also hits your nose. But what a tremendous thing this dirty paper is, my friend. Just think. For example, on any given day, a terrible inner boredom chokes you. Life seems dark, meaningless to you. A person starts philosophizing, like you were blathering just now. In fact, little by little, you can't even do that, and you don't even want to open your mouth. You think no person, no amusement could revive you. The weather is oppressive and meaningless. It's either too hot, or too cold, or too rainy. Passers-by stare at you stupidly and run around after worthless things with their tongues hanging out a foot like goats chasing after a tuft of grass. You pull yourself together and try to analyze this foul state of mind. The insoluble knots of the human soul spread out before you like a riddle. You cling to the word depression that you've read in books like a lifesaver, because for some reason we all have a mania to attach a name to all our troubles, material or spiritual. If we cannot do this, we go completely mad. Although, if people didn't have this mania, doctors would starve to death.
While you're clinging to this word depression and floundering in the boundless sea of inner boredom, you run into an acquaintance you haven't seen for a long time. The moment you see that his clothes are fairly decent, you immediately think of your own pennilessness, and if you're lucky, you borrow a lira or two from your unsuspecting friend. Then the miracle begins. You see that your inside has suddenly brightened, as if a strong wind had stripped away and carried off a layer of fog from your soul. You feel a lightness, an expansiveness. The old oppression has flown away with a flutter. Your eyes look around with satisfaction, and you too start looking for a friend to chat with. There you have it, my dear fellow. 2 dirty pieces of paper accomplish what volumes of books and hours of contemplation couldn't. Because you can't bring yourself to accept that our soul does a somersault for such a cheap price. You may run after nobler causes, a cloud that's risen a few hundred meters higher in the sky, or a cool breeze blowing on the back of your neck, or a clever thought that occurs to you at that moment may want to seem like the cause of this change. But between us, the thing is completely the opposite. It's thanks to the 2 liras that entered our pocket that it's become possible to see that the weather has cleared a bit, to feel the coolness of the breeze, even to think clever things. Get up, my dear fellow. We've arrived at the landing. One day we'll either go mad or rule the world. For now, let's try to find money for Raku and drink a few glasses to our brilliant future. 2. When Nihat finished his words and stood up, he saw that Omer hadn't stirred from his place. He touched his hand to his shoulder. Omer started slightly, but didn't change his position. The other bent down to see if he had fallen asleep and saw that his companion, fixing his eyes on one of the benches on the opposite side, had cut himself off from his surroundings as if watching something extraordinarily interesting. He turned his head in that direction and searched with his eyes. He couldn't see anything. He put his hand on Omer's shoulder again. "Come on, get up," he said. Omer didn't answer. He only screwed up his face with an expression asking to be left alone. "What's going on? Where are you looking?" Omer, finally deciding to turn his head and, as if delivering news of a disaster, "There was a young girl sitting over there. Did you see her?" "I didn't see her. What of it?" "I hadn't seen her either until now." "Are you talking nonsense?" "I'm saying I'd never seen such a creature until now." Nihat screwed up his face as if annoyed and standing up again. "Despite all your big words and your legendary intelligence, you'll never be a serious person." After this sentence, a line of mockery remaining at the corner of his lips continued for several seconds, then gave way to an indifferent expression. Omer had also risen. He was stretching his neck and rising on tiptoe, searching. At one point, he turned to Nihat. "She's still sitting there," he said. Then, fixing his eyes on Nihat's face, "Leave off the chatter. At this moment, I'm living the most important minutes of my life. My feelings have never deceived me until now. Something tremendous has happened or is about to happen. The young girl I saw over there seemed to me like someone I've known since before I was born, since the time when the universe was being formed. How can I explain it to you? Should I say things like, I fell madly in love at first sight, I'm burning, I'm on fire? But the strange thing is, I have nothing else to say. In fact, I'm astonished at how I'm standing here chatting with you. For even a minute of my life from now on to pass far from her means death to me. Don't be surprised that I now look at death, which I was praising to the skies just now, as something terrible. Why shouldn't you be surprised? What do I know? I'm not going to give you explanations. What's the use? Only, without being a know-it-all, give me some advice. What should I do? I'm facing a frightful situation. If I lose sight of her once, I'll spend my whole life until I die just searching, and no doubt this period will be very short. I'm rambling, but I'm speaking extraordinarily truly. The possibility of never seeing her again is the most terrible and, unfortunately, the most likely. Think, at this moment I can't even remember her face, but I'm certain that in a place deeper than memory there has existed since times beyond the mind's grasp a portrait of her as sharply engraved as if carved in stone. If I were to mingle with this crowd with my eyes closed, a force would certainly take me straight to her without any mistake. After these words, which he spoke with extraordinary speed, he actually closed his eyes and took a step forward. With his left hand, he was still holding Nihat's wrist. Nihat looked astonished at the owner of this arm that was trembling violently. Although he was used to every kind of madness from him, this violent excitement seemed somewhat foreign to him. Unable to find anything to say, "What kind of creature are you, Omer?" he said. Omer's sweaty palm squeezed Nihat's wrist tighter. Look, she's still there. Don't you see her?"
When Nihat turned his head in the direction Omer was looking, he saw a dark-haired young girl sitting on one of the benches that had completely emptied. Beside her there was an oldish fat woman, and they were talking. The girl was holding a thick bundle of sheet music in one hand and leaning on the seat with the other. There was an elegant movement in the way she tilted her curly-haired head on her slender neck. The first noticeable characteristic was the expression of strong will that her chin brought out. Between her words, which couldn't be heard from where Nihat stood, she would fall silent as if she had delivered a definite judgment, then begin again as if delivering another judgment. Her gaze was somewhat dark but natural. Indeed, her whole posture and manner showed complete naturalness. Her hand, which from time to time rose from where it was leaning, and after making a gesture slowly descended to the oilcloth of the bench, had fingers thin enough to be called slender and were pale in color. Her nails were cut short at the base and were thin and long. After letting his eyes wander over the girl for a while, Nihat turned his head to Omer and looked at his face as if to say, "So what? What's special about her?" Omer, in a broken voice as if he were delirious,
"Don't say anything. Your face shows what gem you're about to lay," he said. "I've made my decision. I'll go straight over, take the girl by the arm, and—" He was silent for a while, thinking. Then he murmured, "And I'll say something, I suppose. Perhaps she'll start talking before me. She'll certainly recognize me the moment she sees me. There's no other possibility. And when she recognizes me, she won't be able to hide it. Come, let's go together if you like. You stand a bit behind me. Listen to us. Our conversation with a girl we met in worlds whose origin we don't know will certainly not be ordinary." Saying this, he pulled Nihat by the arm. Nihat freed his hand. "Do you intend to cause a scandal on the ferry?" he said. "What kind?" "The girl will immediately call the police, and the police won't hesitate to take a vagrant like you to the station. Do you think, for God's sake, that the world is full of nonsense like the inside of your head? Will you never be able to open your eyes and look at yourself and at people? Is your whole life going to be spent chasing after fantasies, dreams, quixotic aspirations, deceiving yourself and imagining that you and others will do extraordinary things in this world where nothing but ordinary things are done? Just now you were saying a person can't do anything in the world. Now you're attempting frivolities that very few people in the world could do. I don't understand what distinguishes you from an ordinary madman." Omer stiffened his neck as if he had been insulted. "Now you'll see. Your bird brain can't understand the dark and deep relations between people. Wait here." Saying these words, he walked toward the young girl. Nihat involuntarily turned his head toward the sea, said, "Oh no," and began to wait for the first sounds of the scandal that was about to break out. Omer, walking slowly with his eyes fixed on the young girl, suddenly shook his head as if waking from sleep. Just as he approached the girl, a woman's voice right at his ear said, "Oh, Omer, how are you? You haven't been seen." When he turned his head in that direction, he saw that Emine Hanum, a distant relative of his, was sitting beside the young girl. Emine Hanum continued, "Goodness, you've been looking over here for a while. I stayed sitting thinking you'd come, but you just wouldn't stop talking. Come on, we'll be left on the ferry." Both women rose and walked. Omer, confused about what to say, was trying to collect himself. "Well, how would I know, Auntie dear? Does time permit? With lessons, with work? Besides, you know me. You're not going to find fault with me," he said. Aunt Emine laughed. "Goodness, who's going to find fault with you? What good can come from a person who doesn't write even once a year to his own mother and father? Come on now, since we've run into each other anyway. Tell me, how are things?" Omer answered without taking his eyes off the young girl. "Same as always, nothing new." By this time they had stepped onto the bridge. They all walked together toward the Istanbul side. Omer's eyes, sliding past his aunt's fat neck, met the gaze of the young girl who was walking beside them without joining the conversation. The girl studied him for a while with a sustained, distracted look, as if trying to remember something without blinking, then turned her head forward. Omer watched the shadow of her long lashes falling under her eyes for a while longer, then turned to his aunt and made a sign with his head, meaning, "Who is this?" Emine Hanum, with a refinement peculiar to Anatolians who have lived a long time in Istanbul. "Oh, didn't I introduce you? But you two know each other. Do you remember Majide? She's your mother's great-uncle's granddaughter, dear. Of course, when you left Balıkesir, she was only this big. She's been with us for 6 months. She's studying piano. She's also going to a school." She turned her head and looked at Majide. At this point, the girl, shaking Omer's hand, said, "I go to the conservatory," and turned her eyes forward again. Omer, racking his brain, was trying to find and pick out from among his relatives whose number exceeded 100 and who were now scattered across Istanbul, Balıkesir, and many other places, his mother's great-uncle and his granddaughter. When his eyes fell on Aunt Emine, he noticed that her face had taken on a somewhat sad and bewildered expression. He asked. She made various signs meaning it can't be said in front of her. When Omer leaned his head down curiously, the fat woman quickly murmured in a faint voice, "Hush, don't ask what's happened to us. Come see us and I'll tell you." Her eyes moved as if wanting to convey many things. There was an expression in her gaze trying to convey interest and pity for the girl. After casting a quick glance at Majide, who was walking on her right, she turns to Omer and murmured, "The poor thing doesn't know yet. I can't bring myself to tell her. Her father died a week ago. I don't know what I'll do." Omer felt something like joy suddenly flash inside him, and just as quickly he felt a terrible shame because of this feeling. He thought that it wasn't very honest to regard this death as an event that would help him. But inside us we had a calculating side that, without entering into any connection with our moral side, judged events, drew conclusions, and took measures, and, if not in word, then in deed, that side always won, and what it said was done. Aunt Emine, attributing the several seconds of silence that passed while Omer was thinking these things to the sorrow he felt at the death of a relative, said, "Come see us one of these days. It's a long story, I'll tell you." They had come to the tram stop at Eminönü. The woman and the young girl parted from Omer. The young man looked after them for a while and, without admitting it to himself, waited for Majide to turn her head. But she, with her slender, beautiful body on her low-heeled pumps, glided away and, jumping on a tram that arrived just then, extended her hand to Aunt Emine. Omer, still following them with his eyes, jumped when a hand struck his shoulder hard. Nihat had taken on an attitude as if about to fight and was waiting for an explanation. When he saw that Omer didn't open his mouth, he said, "What a fellow you are! I turned my back to see the disgrace you were going to cause on the ferry, and then I looked and you were nowhere to be seen. Then I saw you on the bridge, walking along, chatting with them in a friendly manner. I followed behind. The girl apparently is one of those, eh? And the fat woman has the complete look of a tradesman's wife." Omer laughed.
"You wouldn't think any other way. That blessed head of yours can't rest without fitting everything to an existing measure. This man didn't know that woman. He went up and talked to her. The woman didn't turn him over to the police, so she must be one of those. That's that. Nothing else is possible. There are no extraordinary events in life. Everything is the same as everything else. That's all." Poking his companion's head with his hand, "If I were going to have a brain this flat, I'd rather have none at all. There's nothing by way of imagination." Nihat, not even paying attention to these words, asked, "All right, my dear fellow, what happened then? The moment you went up, did the girl throw her arms around your neck saying, 'Why, where did you come from, you who were my mate in the dark worlds during the formation of the universe?' Even if I believed this, I couldn't believe that fat woman would receive this metaphysical acquaintanceship very calmly." Omer, as if revealing a secret, "We turned out to be relatives, my friend," he said. "I was so busy looking at the girl I didn't see the world. The woman beside her was our very own Aunt Emine, and the young lady is Majida Hanum, a close relative. She goes to the conservatory. Her father died a week ago. She doesn't know yet." Nihat, shaking his head, "May God grant long life to the living," he said. Then, with a mocking look, asked Omer, "Is this the extraordinary meeting outside existing measures? My boy, however much you want to do unusual things in the world, life keeps putting ordinary events in front of you. I'm afraid this will continue to the end of your life, and you'll depart to God's mercy without accomplishing a single thing to make the world gape." "I'm delighted, really. So the girl you said you'd established friendship with during the formation of the universe turns out to be a relative. You probably played together as children. Probably a few lines of that old childish face came to life in some corner of your memory, and your brain, which always works at 41 degrees of fever, immediately wrapped the thing in mysterious veils. You're a comical fellow, that's all." Omer shook his head. "Yes, our meeting really did take place in a very commonplace way, but my feelings toward her are still the same. I'm certain that a bond beyond our wills binds me to her. You'll see how often I'll visit Aunt Amine's house from now on." Nihat burst out laughing. "And this very original love of yours will end up as a cousin affair, won't it? You'll be known as the only young man who seduced his aunt's ward. What can we say? May God grant you success." Omer didn't answer. They changed the subject, and discussing where they would drink that evening, walked towards Bayezid. Third, Majide had been noticing for several days that the household's treatment of her had become strange. She also sensed that this wasn't a sign of anything good. But everyone she asked met her with the answer, "Oh, come now, what's the matter? What would we hide? It's your imagination." Aunt Amine had sidled up to her a few times, taken on the air of someone about to say something, then wandered off muttering nonsense. She wasn't on very good terms with Amine's daughter Samiha anyway, or rather Samiha thought Majide was very conceited, and thinking she had to act aloof to not remain in an inferior position was creating an unnecessary coldness. Uncle Galib, who returned late, tired and worn out from his shop near Yagi Skele, had lost the habit of talking with the household years ago. As soon as he ate his dinner, he would take the newspaper in his hand and begin to spell out the large Latin letters that had raised him from illiteracy to literacy in a short time. As for Nuri, Amine's son, who was in the final year of the military academy, since he came home only once a week or even less often, it was impossible to learn anything from him. Majide didn't press these relatives any further with questions, relatives she had never become close to despite living in the same house for 6 months. Her life here was no different from a boarding house. In the mornings, she took her sheet music and left. In the late afternoons, before it was even dark, she came home and shut herself in her room. Perhaps this aloofness was the reason Samiha was so resentful of her. Because Amine was occupied with her own world, her own friends and amusements, she didn't pay much attention to this quiet young girl living in her house. She would describe her to the guests, who usually came during the day, as if she were an example of her family's nobility and praise her, particularly mentioning that she was versed in music. But she herself was the first to doubt Majide's musicianship, Majide who had never once entered the gatherings where men and women assembled some evenings and made music and enjoyed themselves in a rather traditional style, and who, despite all the urging, hadn't shown even a bit of her musical skill. Because the shop at Yagi Skele had not been doing very well in recent years, although they didn't let on to outsiders and continued to put up acquaintances from the provinces sometimes for weeks and months, they were in considerable straits. And for this reason, they often waited impatiently for a certain sum of money that came month by month from Majide's father. In fact, Uncle Galib looked at Majide no other than as the reason this 40 lira came. But the way of this household, accustomed to running at the tempo of a provincial notable's house, is not the kind to be set right by such sums of 40 or 50 lira. The debts it had once plunged into were tightening around the man's arms day by day, and the poor fellow, still trying to wriggle out of them with the merchant methods of 30 years ago, was becoming completely confused. Because he had been used to getting out of every difficulty quickly in the old days, he hadn't yet given up hope. But today neither did he have the energy of those days of youth, nor were there around him the merchants of those times all like himself. The market, especially the oil and soap trade, was in the hands of cunning, knowledgeable, young, and above all, rich people. Tradesmen who couldn't keep up with them were crushed and pushed aside, and this struggle, which had been going on for about 10 years, had not only melted away the few pieces of land and a few hundred olive trees that Galip Effendi had in his hands, but had also carried off 2 of the 3 houses standing side by side in a back street of Shezadebashi. Some of Aunt Amine's gold coins and pearls had also found their way to the Sandal Bidistani recently.
However, the distress of Aunt Amine, who would sit and cry whenever the subject of their bad situation came up, and who would get headaches and palpitations when forced to sell another of a provincial notable's wife's seemingly inexhaustible jewels, never lasted more than 24 hours. At the first opportunity, she would gather around her a group of Istanbul flatterers with nimble tongues and have parties with music. These friends, who in the old plentiful times had made their living from this family, and who now, although they sensed the decline, wouldn't leave, were under the influence of 2 contrary feelings.
On the one hand, they didn't think it right or humane to leave their old benefactors in difficult times. On the other hand, knowing that all their sources hadn't yet dried up, they didn't want to look for another place to attach themselves until they had eaten the last crumb. As for the fellow townsmen, who from time to time came up from Balıkesir and didn't think it bad to commemorate their old sponging there by eating, drinking, and enjoying themselves for a few more months in Istanbul, they were landing on the household's tottering budget like sledgehammer blows. Majida saw and understood all this, but didn't find it extraordinary. Ever since she could remember, hadn't she seen and heard the same things in her father's big house in Balıkesir? There, too, wasn't the talk always about difficulties, about the crop not being harvested this year, about such and such a field being mortgaged, about such and such a vineyard being sold? Her own mother, too, would get headaches when she broke a gold coin. Her own father, too, when he came home in the evenings, would sit without speaking, his knees drawn up, pulling his prayer beads and sinking into mental calculations impossible to untangle. More than these troubles that had been going on since her childhood without end, something else astonished her. What endless fields, vineyards, houses, olive groves, and gold coins these were. These fortunes that had accumulated from generation to generation and begun to melt in the mill of changing times just wouldn't come to an end. While debts were taken and paid, while fields were sold or planted, daughters were married off with weddings no worse than the old ones. For relatives' weddings, diamond earrings and pearl necklaces were found and produced from somewhere. In this chaotic life, Majida had grown up and been educated more by the impulse of chance. If she hadn't died of one of the various diseases that visited the house in her childhood, it was a chance. If after finishing primary school she hadn't been kept at home but sent to middle school, that too was a chance. If her father hadn't been so lost in inextricable affairs, he might not have believed the words of a few school teachers who advised him to educate his daughter and might have married her off at 15 like her older sister. Majida's life escaped from being the plaything of chance only in the second year of middle school. Because they had sent her to school rather late, at 9 years old, by the time she reached the 7th grade, she had turned 16 and had grown up considerably. Because the heavy atmosphere and domineering manner of a notable's house showed in her bearing, her classmates didn't approach her much. She occupied herself only with her lessons and led a life completely left to itself. There was no one either to take an interest in her studies or to tell her to behave in such and such a way. From time to time, her mother would start to say something about whether her clothes were too revealing or too modest, too tight or too loose, then shrug her shoulders as if to say, "None of my business," and go to her room. Because almost all families sent their daughters to school, she didn't find anything extraordinary in Majida studying, but she didn't hide from herself that she would prefer her to marry right away. The notable's house, consisting of several rooms and storage rooms around a dim vestibule, and again a lot of huge rooms arranged around a wide hall upstairs, was taking on a more and more foreign shape in Majida's eyes day by day. The life at school, the things told by the books she read and the lessons she heard were completely separate from her house, which was as if it had turned to stone 50 years ago and remained in place far from reality, and from the life there. Her clothes scattered here and there in her room, her books piled in confusion on the shelves of locally made walnut wardrobes with carved doors and fronts, didn't belong here at all. A lot of novels and stories that she read one after another, many of which she threw from her hand with a strange disgust, were bringing to life in her mind a life about which the goodness or badness she couldn't pass judgment, but of which the difference and greater reality compared to the one she was in, she clearly saw. Her contact with other classmates at school was rather limited. This came partly from loving solitude and partly from not liking the things they talked about. These various girls between the ages of 13 and 16 would open among themselves topics that would make an adult person blush crimson, and despite always seeming to despise the boys who were their classmates, they would hold forth very knowingly about them.
Even if Majida listened to these conversations with a curiosity she couldn't control, the moment she was alone she felt a great disgust and resolved never to go near her classmates. In the beginning there was also some incomprehension mixed with this disgust. She couldn't understand her classmates who, putting their heads together in groups in the school garden, always said with a curl of the lip that Ahmet's lips were thick, Mehmet's hands were white and soft, that such and such a teacher looked a bit cross-eyed at such and such a girl, that the sewing teacher would never find a husband, all their thoughts revolving around such topics. These subjects seemed meaningless and unnecessary to her. Later, especially after reading many books and forming certain fantasies and new worlds in her head, she began to find such discussions disgusting. Every word of her classmates, even every dream about the future, was soiling one of the beautiful worlds her broad imagination had given birth to. Although she too passed various pictures of the future before her eyes, she kept them like precious objects, even was afraid of thinking about them too often and spoiling their shapes. Just at this time, in the middle of the 7th grade, an adventure she went through separated her even more from her surroundings. But it wasn't really right to call this event, which was born and grew entirely within her and not the smallest sign of which leaked outside, an adventure. 4. Since primary school, Majida had attracted attention for the beauty of her voice and her talent for music. When she was in the 5th grade, her music teacher was an elderly gentleman named Nikati Bey, who made the rounds of more or less all the schools in Balıkesir. When he entered the classroom, he would take out his clarinet from its case, play monotonous school tunes, and have the children sing haphazardly. Somehow, Majida caught the eye of Nikati Bey, a man who combined verses written by certain school principals and teachers who themselves dabbled in composing and were interested in literature, verses faulty in meter, rhyme, and meaning, with music that never rose above the ordinary, a man who in artistic passion had secretly caught fire, but unable to break the yoke of his lack of talent, had over time become easygoing and grown bitter at the world. Nikati Bey made it his business to work with Majida. He talked with her father. In the evenings, after school hours, together with 1 or 2 other private students, he began taking her to the teachers' union and having her practice on an out-of-tune piano.
In a short time, Majida showed progress that astonished even her classmates. In the year she finished primary school, they had her play the piano alone at the concert given by the final class. She showed the greatest skill that could come from an 8-month beginner's hands. Since those in the hall consisted only of parents and a few teachers and officials, and since not a single person among them had the slightest idea about music, they applauded her with quite genuine admiration. Majida continued to take lessons in this way in the first year of middle school, too. Since Necati Bey himself couldn't play the piano very well, these lessons, which lasted about 2 years, didn't result, as often happens, in the student becoming a half-baked musical know-it-all, but continued as a course of study that led forward. Around the time they moved up to the 2nd year of middle school, Necati Bey was transferred to another town. During the vacation, Majida could occupy herself with the piano hardly at all. She neither wanted to go to the teachers' union alone, nor, even if she had wanted to, would it have been looked upon well by those around her. When school opened, she saw that a new young music teacher had come. This was a tall young man named Vedri with black, short hair and a round face. His face had an expression as if it were always smiling, and this caused the girls to start making fun of him from the first day. At first, Bedri got terribly angry at this. In class, his face would turn crimson. He would stand for minutes without saying anything, biting his lips. But a little later, his face would take on that smiling look again. Moving his eyes over the students again and again, he would continue explaining and sit down at the piano. The music classroom, which was large and always cold, was the most suitable place for the children to let themselves go. The boys would play the roughest practical jokes. The young girls would find the opportunity there to talk and then try to stuff their handkerchiefs in their mouths to stifle their laughter.
The young teacher, whose harshest word never went beyond, "Please, is that becoming of you?" would try to suppress the noise by striking the piano harder or by immediately starting a song to be sung all together. At such times, the school principal, Refik Bey, would sometimes appear in the glass-paneled door of the classroom, look with contemptuous eyes at this undisciplined teacher, invite the children to silence with his furrowed brows, and be met with sycophantic grins. Gradually, Bedri began to find these things natural. Most of the children were such spoiled and badly raised creatures that it was impossible to bring them into line with nice words and requests. Besides, except for a history teacher who gave terrible beatings and a language teacher who had gained a reputation as the zero giver, no one's class passed in peace. Even the principal's own classes were pandemonium. Learning that the same situation existed in the city's other schools, Bedri gave up and chose to occupy himself seriously only with the few who were interested in his subject, leaving the rest to their own devices. Machide was among these enthusiasts. At first, she hadn't attracted much attention because she sat quietly in a corner, but a short while later she gathered all of Bedri's interest. The young man would speak with excitement to the school principal and other teachers as if he had discovered something about this extraordinarily talented student, saying that she absolutely had to be trained. The teachers who listened to these words with great curiosity and approval would either smile behind his back or look at each other meaningfully. As for Machide, with a habit left over from the times she took lessons with Necati Bey, she had perhaps never once looked carefully at her teacher's face. When they were together, her eyes and mind were entirely on the sheet music, on Bedri's fingers, or chasing after vague daydreams into which she would drift from time to time. What they talked about hardly ever went beyond the piece they were working on. In both of them was the blindness of people attached to some form of art and carrying, consciously or unconsciously, an artistic passion inside them. This obliviousness, regarded by those around them and very often by themselves as stupidity, would perhaps have continued between this teacher and student, but the school principal, Refik Bey, helped both of them turn their eyes and thoughts to matters other than music. One day in the late afternoon, while the children were going home, teacher Bedri was sitting in the teacher's room writing a letter to his mother in Istanbul. When the sound of the children's footsteps in the corridor had thinned out, he quickly put the letter in an envelope, sealed it, wrote the address, and dashed outside looking for a student. Since he slept at the school and didn't intend to go out that evening, he wanted to give the letter to one of the children whose way passed in front of the post office. He looked from the street door towards the garden. Everyone had gone. He turned back to go himself, picked up his hat. Just then the sounds of a piano came to his ears from the music room. "Machide must be here. I'll send it with her," he said. He walked in that direction. Just as he opened the door, Machide had closed the piano lid and picked up her bag. "I practiced a bit, sir," she said, wanting to leave. Bedri made way for her and said, "Drop this in the mailbox as you pass the post office." The young girl put the envelope in her bag and, bending her knees slightly, said, "Goodbye. Don't forget the letter in your bag." "I won't, sir." Machide went out into the garden and walked quickly along the sandy path. At that moment, Bedri, returning to the teacher's room, saw that the principal had burst out of a dark corner of the corridor, passed quickly by him, and run towards the garden. Although Refik Bey's haste in passing by as if he hadn't noticed him astonished Bedri, he didn't think much about it. The next evening was Machide's lesson day. They were to work together for an hour after school. Going to the music room, Bedri saw that all 6 students to whom he gave private lessons in this way were there. "It's not your day. Why did you stay?" he said. But inwardly he was also pleased by this extra interest of theirs. The girls exchanged meaningful glances. Machide, near Bedri, had bowed her head, blushing crimson. One of the 2 male students said, "The principal ordered it. From now on, we're not to take separate lessons. We're to work all together." For a moment, Bedri looked at those before him without understanding what they meant. Then he shrugged his shoulders, opened the sheet music, and listened first to Machide, then to the others, saying to the remaining, "You come tomorrow evening too," and went out of the room. He wanted to see the principal and ask the reason for this new order.
When he couldn't find him in his office, he turned back and went outside to get some air. His 7 students were walking 5 or 10 steps ahead with their bags in their hands. He caught up with them. They walked together for a while. Contrary to usual, this evening they were all silent. Bedri said, "If you're all together in the lessons, of course it will be more useful, but on condition that you pay attention and don't start chattering and become completely harmful." The children continued to be silent. Bedri, turning to Majid, said, just for something to say, "You didn't forget the letter, did you?" The young girl suddenly turned crimson. She fell into terrible confusion. The other children were also looking down, blushing and biting their lips so as not to laugh. In a barely audible voice, Majid said, "The principal took the letter, sir." Bedri stopped where he was and asked, "What do you mean?" "I don't know, sir. Yesterday, before I'd even gone out the garden gate, he came running after me. He asked for the letter you'd just given me. As I was giving him the envelope, he asked, 'What's in the letter?' I said, 'I don't know. Bedri Bey gave it to me to mail.' Then he read the address on the envelope. 'All right, run along and don't carry letters to the post and such again,' he said. Then he sent the letter with Enver from the 3rd class. Bedri said nothing. They had come to the market. 'Well, goodbye,' he said, and parted from his students. He entered a coffee house that the teachers usually filled. It seemed that all his colleagues, including teachers from other schools, were there. Some were playing poker, some backgammon, a few were watching the players and helping both sides. He saw that the principal was shuffling cards in a far corner. He had tucked his right foot under him and put his hat beside him. From time to time, he scratched his hairless head with his left hand, then busied himself with the cards again. When he saw Bedri in the distance, at first he pretended not to see him, but as soon as he noticed him advancing toward him, he turned his head in that direction. "Won't you come and join us, my friend? Come over here. What will you drink?" he said, hospitably. Bedri said, "Thank you. I won't drink anything. I just want to talk to you for a moment." The other teachers looked with annoyance at this spoil-sport who rarely came to the coffee house. The principal said, "Certainly, my friend. Shall we just finish this game? Is it urgent? Very well." Turning to one of the spectators beside him, "Here, play a hand for me. Be careful, I'm 2 games behind," he said. He got up. They went to a relatively quiet corner. At first, Bedri couldn't find anything to say. The principal was quicker. "I suppose you're going to ask about that letter business. I've been waiting since morning for you to come. When you didn't appear, I said to myself, he must have understood his mistake too. My dear fellow, you've traveled a lot and seen a lot, but we have experience too. In small places like this, a person must calculate his steps very carefully or they'll make you the talk of the town. This isn't Germany. You were in Germany, weren't you? No, Vienna. Well, it's all the same. This isn't Europe. True, we want to be like Europe, but slowly." Bedri cut off the principal's words with a sharp, nervous gesture. "Why are you saying these things?" he said. After a pause, he added, "Why did you take the letter? Or after reading the address, why didn't you give it back instead of sending it with someone else?" He had come here to have a real quarrel with the principal. He felt the moment approaching. The principal put his hand on his shoulder and said in a voice very much like sincerity, "To save you from a difficult situation, from gossip that would immediately spread everywhere." Bedri, his voice trembling, said, "Are you taking me for a fool? No one but you saw me sending a letter to the post with that girl, and even if they had seen, I cannot imagine that such an impropriety would occur to anyone but you." He leapt from his seat. His face had gone pale. "Even having to talk about this matter, having to explain myself to you, gives me terrible pain. To remain under such a base accusation."
The principal pulled him by the arm and sat him down. His voice still had that calm, sincere tone. "It may be true you're angry," he said. "Only be assured that I did nothing but my duty. Be assured that I thought nothing about you but goodwill. Only I must keep in mind that the community is not like this, and that the majority will pass judgments with ill will. You put me in a disgraceful position before the students. If I had not done this, you would have been in a worse position. How am I going to look the students in the face? Oh, come, these are ordinary things. They're not worth getting so upset about. It's enough to act with a little care." He stood up. The game he had been watching with his eye had ended, and the friend he had left in his place had lost. To cut the talk short, "We'll talk at length at school tomorrow. In time, you'll agree with me." Then, as if it had just occurred to him, he added, "Oh, I didn't think it proper for you to give the children lessons separately in the evenings. Certain talk has reached my ears. It's a co-educational school, you know. We mustn't shake the parents' trust. Excuse me," and he walked away. As he began to play, he said to his colleagues who were looking at him with questioning eyes, "It's nothing. Does he think everyone's a fool or what? What things have passed through our hands? Can you just let wolves like this loose among young girls? From time to time we have to show them our eyes aren't blind." He took the cards in his hand. "All right now, this time I'll get the better of you," he said, shuffling, and as he dealt, he murmured as if talking to himself, "I've been a principal for all these years. I've never had an incident at any school I've been at. Am I going to get myself in trouble at this age for this dandy?" Bedri had remained where he was. The terrible sentences and heavy insults he had prepared on the way, even the quarrel he had intended to start, had come to nothing. It was impossible not just to defend himself, but even to curse a person who defended with such naturalness a baseness his mind couldn't grasp, a slander he was ashamed even to think about. He immediately understood that every word he said would be met with an answer impossible to counter. The sad impossibility of being able to defend himself against a person who took ill will as a given and didn't allow that a person could be upright, sincere, and honorable had tied his hands. He left the coffee house quickly and returned to the school. He didn't feel like playing anything. Rummaging in his suitcase, he took out a book at random and tried to read.
When Majide parted from her classmates and returned home, she went straight up to her room. She put her bag gently in a corner. She calmly took off her jumper, washed her face, then went back to her bag, took out a geography book, and sat down on the cushion to study. Although she had read the same page twice, she hadn't understood what it was about. Her thoughts kept slipping away in other directions. She clenched her teeth and frowned as if struggling with someone. Her chest was rising and falling rapidly, and her fists were trembling. Finally, she flung the book in her hand to one side, threw herself on the cushion, and began to cry, sobbing. To keep her voice from being heard, she was furiously sinking her teeth into the straw pillow. This self-restraint was increasing her rage all the more and bringing a terrible headache. She was crying from rage, only from rage. She was angry at everyone. At Bedri, first of all, at the principal, at her classmates, at herself, and those around her. What right did they have? What right did they have to humiliate her, to make fun of her, to cause all these disgusting events? Going to school seemed to her a terrible thing. Not going and telling the reason she wasn't going, or thinking of this reason being whispered among others, seemed even more terrible. Last evening, after the principal's treatment, she had tried to control herself and had succeeded, but today at school she hadn't missed the attitude her classmates had taken toward her. The incident, which had immediately spread through the school, had caused those who thought Majide's silence was conceit, or who couldn't tolerate her talent, to go openly on the attack. Near her, so she could hear, things were being said like, "Oh my, what things have been going on without our knowing, thank goodness for the principal," and glances were becoming 10 times more meaningful. She wasn't proud and conceited, not at all.
In fact, perhaps on the contrary, her self-confidence was still very weak. But despite this, she couldn't understand how these children could give so much importance to someone else as to occupy their whole minds with her. What could occupy a person as much as herself, as much as her own thoughts, troubles, fears, and shortcomings? Yet all her classmates seemed to have magic spectacles before their eyes that prevented them from seeing themselves. Such stupid blindness couldn't be explained any other way. She felt a deep contempt for those around her. She considered it an injustice to herself to become excited enough over this to change the course of her life. "Whatever they do, I won't even pay attention," she said, and got up. She washed her face at the tap on the landing. When she came back to her room and sat on the cushion, she picked up the book she had thrown from her hand a moment ago and went over the next day's lesson with considerable calm. Only from time to time her eyes would drift. The image of her treacherous-faced classmates would pass through her mind, or Bedri would stand before her with his embarrassed and angry manner. But each time, Majde would shake her head slightly and raise her eyebrows, pushing these things away, and return to her lessons. The next day, school didn't seem as changed as she had feared. Even while still on the way, she had established that there was no discomfort inside her. Her feet were hopping quickly over the broken pavement as if she were going to receive good news, with a meaningless feeling. Before class in the morning and during the breaks between lessons, she saw that the girls had found other things to occupy them. She saw that the incident of 2 days ago would be forgotten much sooner than she had thought. She remembered, perhaps with a little sadness, but with a relieved breath, that she had never held an important place among her classmates, that she could never be the center of great and lasting attention. Within a few days, life took its old form. Now 7 people were taking music lessons together. Bedri was somewhat more distracted, somewhat more nervous than before. From time to time he would shout over small things, but a little later he would look around with soft glances, as if wanting to be forgiven. His manner toward Majide in particular was as diffident as it was compassionate. He seemed to guess how much the young girl had suffered because of him. He wanted both to give her the feeling that nothing was the matter and to make her understand that he was not at fault in what had happened. From time to time, when they ran into each other in the corridor, they would fix their eyes on each other for a very brief glance, and at that moment they would realize they agreed on certain matters. When the children were in class, Bedri would sometimes pass in front of the classroom. At these times, Majide would sense that he slowed his steps, and his eyes, looking through the glass-paneled door into the classroom, were searching for her. A closeness between 2 people who had suffered the same injustice was beginning to be established between them. Majide, in particular, was under the influence of Bedri's heavy, distracted manner. In the late afternoons, returning home, she would sometimes fall behind and watch Bedri's tall figure, his slightly drooping shoulders, his head always bent forward, disappear down the slope as he went into town on some errand. Although she didn't want to admit it even to herself, his talking too much with other girls really annoyed her. At such times, she would ask herself, "I wonder if the principal wasn't right." But remembering that all these changes had begun after the principal's intervention, she tried to clear herself in her own eyes. Although her classmates seemed to have forgotten that incident, they continued to use any occasion when Bedri and Majide happened to be side by side or exchanged a few words as a pretext for meaningful glances. This situation bewildered Majide completely, but for some reason it was drawing her closer to Bedri. Now in every class her eye was on the glass of the door, and her heart beating fast, she waited for him to pass through the corridor. When she heard footsteps outside, whatever position she was in, her head would turn. Although she was quite afraid of doing anything that would attract the other children's attention, she would meet Bedri's glances for a long time and feel a strange pride in her courage. However, neither her own nature nor Bedri's manner seemed likely to allow these feelings to grow any further. The young man never used the opportunities and possibilities to speak, whether during the evening lessons or during breaks or on the way home from school. On the other hand, at an entirely unexpected moment, he would try to express many things with a furtive glance. He too was no longer indifferent.
The principal had turned his eyes, unwillingly, on Majide. Now, as much as the young girl's astonishing musical talent, her figure, her pair of hands, and her eyes in which many things were hidden concerned him. It was impossible to confuse this 16-year-old girl, in whose words and manner there was no affectation at all, who looked at a person long and steadily with a courage and an openness rarely seen in a woman, whose eyes expressed many things, but who at the same time knew how to control them with a very natural will, with the school's other students. He waited impatiently for the times he would work with her, but in these hours whose dreams he had dreamed the night before, he didn't show Majide even half the interest he showed the other children. In this there was perhaps the influence of a justified fear, a desire that no gossip should come to the girl. He had no intention of carrying on a student-teacher flirtation of the kind seen sickeningly often in every school. At the same time, it was certain that Majide, unlike the other children, was not so lacking in talent as to occupy a person for hours. But beside all these reasons, there was something that kept him away from the girl more strongly than these, and in truth drew him closer. Bedri was an artist not accustomed to always controlling his feelings. He was afraid of falling in love, of truly and madly loving. If he could, he would have treated the girl differently to keep her away from him, to ward off this danger. But he couldn't go that far. He couldn't keep himself from gazing at Majide with infinite tenderness and admiration at moments when he thought no one noticed. Nor was he at all unhappy to see that these weak moments of his were sensed by the girl. Majide's not showing her feelings particularly pleased him, because any sign of satisfaction from the young girl would certainly have upset him as much as an unwilling, cold response. While these two people who found themselves so close to each other spiritually were floundering, one in the childishness of her age, the other in the childishness of his artistry, the end of the year came and school closed. Bedri returned to Istanbul to his mother's, Majide to her wooden, big house. Neither had any tangible memento left except a few photographs taken together with the other children in the school garden or on the May 5th outing. Only in their minds, not each other's image, but the powerful memory, indeed something of a continuation of the feelings they had once strongly felt, remained for a long time. When Bedri was going to the station, he had gotten into a carriage. On the way, he saw Majide walking with a few classmates. The children greeted their teacher by bowing their heads. Although both Bedri and Majide avoided even turning their eyes to each other at that moment, they thought they had gazed at each other long and hard. When schools opened in September, a different music teacher came. It was said that Bedri had stayed in Istanbul. That year passed, leaving almost no trace in Majide's mind. The new teacher, who was also very young, continued the children's private music lessons. Majide gave a few concerts with a group of students and was applauded. She took exams in a lot of subjects, she couldn't understand what they added to her mind, and finished middle school without using her father's influence in any subject except French. Now everything was complete. What was to be done after this, neither her mother, nor her father, nor her teachers, nor any girl's mother, father, or teachers knew. Like everyone, chance would determine her fate. Perhaps after a while they would want to marry her off to someone. She would refuse. They would put forward another. She wouldn't want him either. The struggle wouldn't last very long before the young girl's causeless stubbornness would end. She too would finally say, whatever happens, and bow her head, and something would happen. So life was a foggy, pitching sea in which 2 steps ahead couldn't be seen. Since we were to be the play chance of chance, why did we have a will? What good were the feelings filling our chests and the thoughts stirring in our minds if we couldn't use them?
Rather than coming into the world with the desire to shape our lives and our surroundings, wouldn't it be more comfortable, more sensible, to be empty and soft enough to easily take the shape life and environment gave us? While Majide was trying in a foggy way to think about and answer such things, the days were piling up on top of each other like stalks cut by a sickle. She tried to console herself with the piano. It had been possible, without much insistence, to get her father to buy an old, out-of-tune piano that had once passed from a Greek's house to the Abandoned Property Administration and had recently been put up for sale at a cheap price. This poor instrument, placed in a corner of the large hall on the upper floor with its rusty candle holders pointing at the low ceiling, gave Majide only sadness. She had seen the only benefit of the music lessons she had taken until now as proving that there was music in the world capable of stirring the human soul, but she hadn't been slow to understand how far she still was from it. When she opened a piece of sheet music and began to practice, the melodies she had once heard from Bedri and later from the other teacher who wasn't as good as he, would come to life in her ears, and faced with this merciless trick of her memory and imagination, she would helplessly slam down the lid and get up. She hadn't taken up music like her other classmates so that it would help raise the level of the husband they would find. She didn't look at it as a girlhood dress to be cast aside after marriage. She clung to it as a close friend she would carry with her all her life, as the meaning of that life. She was spending the hot days of summer lying in the dim hall, sinking into endless thoughts, going on vineyard and garden outings organized by her mother with the neighbors, joining in the games of wild friends, and waking from this temporary forgetting herself with an even stronger inner boredom. At this time, again by chance, another direction was given to her life which she was tired of even thinking how it would continue. Aunt Amina, who had come from Istanbul to Balıkesir, both to visit and to take another look at whether there was anything left to sell, had become enchanted with this dignified, beautiful relative so unlike her flighty daughter. Especially when she learned that she was studying music, she raised the roof. With an air that suggested she looked with some pity on the relatives who had stayed in Balıkesir, "I swear I won't leave Macide here. Is this a girl to be wasted here? In Istanbul she'll both study and see the world, and instead of going to seed here, she'll go around and have fun with Samiha," she said. Then, seizing her girl's mother and father at their most vulnerable point, "You can't find your daughter a husband here except a civil servant, whereas she deserves doctors, engineers. Just let her stay with us for a few years and you'll see," she added. Macide was crazy about this cheerful, friendly aunt. Each time she came and went, she squeezed Macide's cheeks tightly, told her about Istanbul and the friends she would find there, and answered Macide's question, "I wonder if I could go to the conservatory," with, "Oh, is that even a question? You can go wherever you like." Aunt Amina seemed to Macide like a plump, oldish angel come from heaven to save her. Her mother and father didn't object much. Since the season was approaching autumn, they had some money left from the harvest. They made a few Istanbul outfits for Macide. They added to her and Aunt Amina's luggage a tin of green olives, several tins of honey, and 2 small rugs, and put their child, whom they would never see again, on the train and sent her off. At the station, only her mother cried. Her father contented himself with fiddling with his collarless shirt from time to time, and when the train departed, frowning and shaking his head slightly. The Eye. Nihat and Omer walked slowly from the bridge towards Babi Ali Gadesi. They wanted to go to Bayazit, looking at the bookshop windows. They were climbing the slope in silence, a slope on whose 2 sides good and bad books in tasteless covers were displayed alongside liver kebab and artichokes in olive oil. As they passed near the post office, it occurred to Omer to break the devil's leg and stop by the office today, but the lunch break was approaching. Going would be ridiculous. He dragged his feet with a strange sadness that he thought came from a sense of duty and found meaningless. He paid 15 kurus for one of the magazines lined up beside the water tap on a tobacconist's counter. After glancing at the names of the writers, he folded it and put it in his pocket. Nihat was distracted all the while. Although they didn't have enough money for a lunch, he didn't even notice that Omer had paid 15 kurus for a magazine. In the avenue, which was very empty before noon, they didn't run into anyone they knew. When they came to Bayazit, they sat at one of the coffee houses beside the mosque. There was no one here. In one of the far corners, 2 poor science faculty students were busy cramming their lessons furiously. Further on, towards the avenue, a bearded wreck of a theology student was smoking a water pipe and surveying his surroundings with cunning eyes. They sat for a while watching the passers-by in the square, the trams, the beggars. Finally, Nihat raised his head as if waking from a dream. "We need money, my friend," he said. "Understood. In a little while we'll find a friend among those coming to lunch and ask him. A lira will be enough, right?" Nihat looked at him with contempt and anger. "Not that kind of money. Real money.
money to do business with. Are you going into trade? Leave off the chatter, my friend. Your head doesn't understand these things, just as mine can't grasp your meditations that roam the skies. I certainly don't intend to remain a philosophy faculty student until the end of my life. Then don't remain a student, become a graduate. Do you think even if I graduate it will satisfy me? Omer becoming a bit more serious.
Really, Nihat, he said. Lately you've become a somewhat mysterious fellow. You say strange things, you're friends with all sorts of people I've never seen, especially that tartar-faced fellow you were with the other day. I didn't like him at all. What is all this? Nihat surveyed his surroundings with a suspicious look, then said, Be quiet. You're a chatterbox. Don't stick your nose into things you don't understand. Keep on saying clever things and building fantasies. When you wise up and return to reality, we'll talk at greater length. After thinking for a while, as if he had changed his mind, However, I'll talk to you one of these days. Let me just say this much. We need money. You need it? Who are you? How much is needed? Don't ask who we are for now. The money we want isn't a fixed amount either. Money is always needed, constantly, without ever stopping. Omer laughed and said, I'm beginning to get curious. Nihat cut off the conversation with his hand. Enough. I said I'd talk to you. Wait. Now let's think about lunch and then about this evening. Until 2 o'clock, they surveyed those coming to the restaurant across from the coffee house. Although there were 1 or 2 acquaintances among them, there was no one close enough to order them a meal. Finally, giving up hope, they filled their stomachs with a samit each and a tea. Since it was school vacation time, these coffee houses were filled with teachers who had come from various parts of the country to Istanbul to amusement. These summer customers, who came 1 or 2 at a time in the afternoon and met other friends here and spent their time until evening playing backgammon, would get up in groups after deciding where to go at night and make their way to Beyoğlu's cheap beer halls, just as they had come. After dark, only students and those who hadn't been able to save money for the vacation during the school year would remain here. Omer and Nihat sat until evening, changing places from time to time because of the sun. Both were lost in their own world. Nihat was giving free rein to his mind full of plans and schemes. Omer was thinking many contradictory things without settling on anything specific. Several times he reached into his pocket wanting to read the magazine he had bought a while back, but he couldn't get past the titles of the articles. Striking the pages he had folded in his hand on the table, he muttered, God, is there nothing to save a person from this inner boredom? Very often it was like this. His whole mind would suddenly empty, a heaviness would settle on his chest and throat, and he would feel the longing for certain violent desires whose nature he didn't know. Nihat said, If you knew what you wanted, you wouldn't be bored. Omer answered as if pleading, Tell me something to want. Tell me something worth dying for, and I'll seize it with all 4 limbs. Nihat laughed. See, you immediately go astray. Nothing in life is wanted for the sake of dying for it. Everything should be for our living. Let me even go further, for our own living. You're so stuck in the emptiness inside your head that you want to plunge into a second emptiness by immediately looking for something to die for. To live better than everyone, more grandly than everyone, to live ruling over people, powerful, perhaps even a bit cruel. What else is there to want in the world? Devote your life to this goal, and you'll see how you'll suddenly come alive. Nihat's thin face had suddenly flushed. His quick-moving eyes had begun to shine. Omer murmured without disturbing his lethargy in the least, You really have begun to change, Nihat, or I haven't known you very well. What passions were hidden inside you, it turns out. But aren't you too selfish? Perhaps your words are true, but there's a place inside me that doesn't want them to be true. A waiter in a white apron turned the electric switch. A lot of bulbs hanging on wires stretched among the trees suddenly came to life with a yellow light. Just then 4 people came, arguing heatedly, and squeezed in next to Omer and Nihat's table. Nihat, turning to them, said, Where do you grace us from, masters? Among the newcomers, one who stood out for his short stature and nervous movements answered with another question. Are you here? Then he added,
What a silly question, isn't it? We see you're here. Why do we ask, I wonder? A peculiar meaninglessness of Turkish. No other language in the world has this ability, the ability to talk for hours and express nothing. Another of the newcomers, also short, narrowing his eyes whose color couldn't be told behind thick-lensed glasses, said, "Are you aware that in your question you're busy increasing Turkish's capacity for this?" Omer screwed up his face and murmured, "Oh no, the witticisms have started again. The times when my head is empty seem more meaningful to me than these endless jokes." Nihat said in the same low voice, "Consider that both of them are famous men of this country. There must certainly be some virtue in the words of a great poet and an even greater writer," and joined in Omer's snickering. Of those who had come, no one but the first two who had spoken opened their mouths. Nihat sidled up to one of the others and they exchanged a few words. The other nodded yes with his head. Nihat immediately turned to Omer. "Done. We're safe for this evening," he said. Omer heaved a sigh. Seeing that this news didn't please him much, Nihat asked, "What's the matter? Didn't you like it? Are you aware how wretched we are? Why? You talk as if you've never drunk freeloaded raka in your life. For God's sake, be quiet. My whole life, our whole life, is disgrace. So you were a monument of virtue? No, no, but this much is certain. I don't want to be the way I am today. A completely different life, a less ridiculous and meaningful life, that's what I want. Perhaps it's possible to search and find this, too. But there's such a devil inside me. He always makes me do things completely different from what I want. It's useless trying to escape from his hands. Not just me, we're all toys in his hands. Even your plans for ruling the world, I'm sure, are his product." Unable to be patient any longer, Nihat cut off Omer's words. "For God's sake, leave off these mystical lectures. I understand your trouble. Only if I tell you to your face you'll be angry. Tell me. You want to get married." Omer looked disgusted and said, "Idiot."
Then he took the magazine out of his pocket and began to leaf through it. Nihat, turning to the thick-spectacled gentleman who had been speaking a moment ago. "Well, Ismet Sherif Bey, today's article of yours was exquisite. We have no other writer who attacks his enemies with such sharp weapons and powerful logic. Every week we wait impatiently for your articles." Omer, raising his head from the magazine, "Are you reading a reader's letter?" he said. "Am I saying something wrong?" "No, but add this too. At the head of the enemies our friend Ismet Sherif floors is himself, since a month later he always asserts, more strongly, the opposite of what he said a month before. The first opponent he kills is again Ismet Sherif. Isn't that right, Emin Kamil?" The great poet who had been talking a moment about Turkish's capacity for meaninglessness and who seemed to be in a state of argument with Ismet Sherif on every subject, said, "Of course, of course." Ismet Sherif, trying to straighten his head, which had tilted slightly towards his left shoulder as a result of a wound received in childhood, said, "Those who don't understand that life is a chain of changes and that every change is evolution are bigoted minds." And not seeing the need for another answer, he fiddled with the scar on his neck. This rather large wound, opened on his neck by a stray shell fragment when he and his father were in Edirne during the Balkan War, was the most important event of Ismet Sherif's life. This had not only become the subject of his greatest novel, but together with his father, whom he said had died heroically in a sortie from Edirne with his company, had played the most important role in the formation of his character and mind. Now, with the articles he wrote once a week for one of the big newspapers, he touched on all political, economic, and literary issues inside and outside the country, and ended each article with a sharp judgment and remedy that followed a clever chain of logic.
The poet Emin Kamil, who very often walked, drank, and thought together with this great writer and thinker, but who at the same time considered it his duty to object to every idea and every word of his friend, was an heir with no job or occupation. He spent the greater part of his life sitting at his father's farm near Yeşilköy, hunting, keeping dogs, and making music lovers happy by writing a few deeply meaningful poems a year. Since he had nothing else to do, in recent years he had taken an interest in Buddhism. He had cut his hair at the roots and walked barefoot around the farm wanting to reach nirvana. Then he had given this up and for several months had been an admirer of the Chinese philosopher Lao Tzu. He walked around with French books on Chinese philosophy in his hand, trying to explain life and people according to them. Although he had an intelligent and sensitive side, he was distressed at not being taken very seriously among his friends, and tried to make up for the pain of this by surveying his surroundings with a proud contempt. Nihat and Omer had once put out a youth magazine and had come to know these two masters by asking them for a lead article and a poem. Although the magazine had long since gone under, and new ones that likewise quickly went under had taken its place, this friendship continued. Although Omer was no longer occupied with such things, Nihat still had connections with various magazines. From time to time, he would publish articles called Youth Movements in the newspapers Ismet Sharif wrote for, and his writings, whose meaning wasn't very easy to understand and gave the impression of attacking an enemy he didn't name openly, would be hotly debated by some young people. As for the young men who had come with Ismet Sharif and Emin Kamil, they had dropped out of their studies and taken up journalism. Since their Turkish wasn't good and they knew almost nothing, they could not get beyond being reporters. They would sit silently in the master's company and pass the time admiringly laughing at the jokes they endlessly cracked. Ismet Sharif suddenly leapt from his seat and said commandingly, "Come on, let's go." His often-seen domineering manner made a sad contrast with his neck which lay meekly towards his left shoulder. They all got up together. Omer left the money for the tea he had drunk on the tin table. Nihat paid his own money too. The others, after a small argument, had decided to go to a tavern nearby in the Koska area that they had recently discovered. They all walked together. This low-ceilinged place, which from outside looked more like a tinker shop than a tavern, had no one in it but a few elderly evening drinkers with unshaven faces and 2 or 3 tradesmen, plus a musician in dark glasses sitting on a chair beside the counter with his oud leaning against him, and a boy of 10 or 12 wearing shoes without socks on his feet. These seemed to be resting after playing for a while. The boy with the long, sallow face immediately caught Omer's eye. In his manner, an innocence he had yet to shed and a shiftiness and cunning he had yet not fully adopted were mixed. As he moved his large brown eyes around, he was trying to assume a sick, pitiable air. But when from time to time he forgot himself and looked with anxious eyes at the oud player beside him, or when his eye caught the various metse the Armenian tavern-keeper was carrying to the customers and sighed with longing, he took on a truly pitiable, heart-rending look. They all squeezed around a small table. The tavern-keeper immediately brought a carafa of raki in a tray, along with small pastries, bean salads, and fried pickerel. They began to talk amid the noise of the music which had started again. The poet Emin Kamil was philosophizing about the boy who was singing. Ismet Sharif was trying to expound on our national wounds in the manner of an article. The journalist youths continued to remain respectfully silent. At one point, Nihat began to tell those present what Omer had done that morning. Omer took out the said magazine from his pocket again with an annoyed air and set about reading. Nihat's story had begun to make those at the table roar with laughter when Omer, suddenly, his eyes shining, struck the magazine in his hand on the table. "Look, look," he said, "there's a poem here. It says so clearly the things that drive me mad. You don't understand me. I'm sure the one who wrote this will understand me." Picking up the magazine from the table again, he began to read. This was a poem called The Devil by one of the well-known poets.
Omer read with his voice trembling and like a man who wanted to pour out all his insides, looking now and then into the eyes of those across from him. The poem spoke of a devil who chased us with his shadow, who whispered from behind, whose ice-cold hands roamed over the back of our neck, who didn't let us escape anywhere but seized us tight, of a power that made us shiver and tremble before it like a skinny child. When Omer finished the poem, his forehead was covered with sweat. "Look at these lines," he said, and read again a few verses from the middle of the poem. "Him I've known since childhood, since my first dreams. When I walk alone, he is the step behind me. Fear of him, inside me, creating a timid world." Omer repeated as if shouting, "Yes, yes, fear of him, creating this timid world inside me. I'm not this. I'm going to be something else. If only this fear weren't there. If I weren't afraid of this devil whom I'm sure will never let me do anything fully or well." Emin Kamil, shaking his head and blinking his eyes nervously, "Why are you angry? Why are you complaining?" he said. "How do you know that what you call the devil inside you isn't your most precious part? Those like you who have no sense organs but their 5 senses can never escape from this constant fear. If you could reach the real causes and origins, you would see that our weakest part is outside us. It's the 7 colors that blind our eyes, the sounds that deafen our ears, what we eat that rusts our mouths, our endless running that first excites and then stops our hearts. The superior person is one who values not his outside, but his inside." Nihat couldn't restrain himself. "You don't seem to be neglecting your outside very much either, master. Despite all the wisdom of Lao Tzu, you're leading a rather sweet and salty life." Emin Kamil was about to answer, but Ismet Sharif was quicker, turning to Omer. "It's nothing extraordinary. This devil is in all of us. Our artistic side is his child. It's he who takes us outside daily life, who makes us realize our humanity, that we're not machines. What Emin Kamil says is nonsense. Inside and outside aren't different. These are nothing but 2 aspects of one idea." Omer had drifted off to other things and wasn't listening. Nihat, raising his glass to his mouth, "However, you are not very different from Emin Kamil," he said, "especially in immediately taking things seriously and philosophizing about them. You are alike. You still haven't learned our Omer. A small thing can carry him to tremendous excitements. He thinks he sees a world behind a small leaf and lives without seeing the big world. He's convinced there's a universe inside him whose origin he can never learn." Then, turning to Omer, he added, "When you turn to life, to reality, to your interests, neither devil nor prophet will remain inside you. Learn how simple a machine your body and soul are. Determine what you want and start advancing towards them with determination. You'll see." Omer shook his head. "I don't understand any of you. I can't find an answer to give either, but I'm sure I'm not mistaken. There's a power that draws us to do things we don't want. This is certain. We ought to be different, better. This is also certain. How to reconcile these, I don't know." Nihat laughed. "And you won't learn till the end of your life." The tavern had emptied. Ismet Sharif, whose crooked head had begun to sway after the 3rd glass, and Emin Kamil, whose nervous movements had increased, had sunk into a heated argument. It wasn't clear whether they were rejecting or accepting each other's words. Both were using words of great meaning, intricate sentences. They would pause at certain points in their words and check the effect they had made. Sometimes they would both start to speak at the same time and go on without listening to each other. Omer tried to understand what the argument was about.
He noticed that words from the upper class like perception, contemplation, criterion, system, consciousness were mixed with samples of intellectual slang like "I'll be damned," idea mongers, politics peddler, ideal profiteer. God, how much these people repeat themselves, he murmured. Nihat asked, "What did you say?" Omer, who had accustomed himself to openly pouring out everything that passed through his mind and heart to his friend, this time, for the first time, found it unnecessary to tell him what he was thinking, and shaking his head, "Nothing, I wasn't aware." The six-sided wooden wall clock across from them showed 11. Grabbing his hat, Omer said, "I'll be right back," and rushed out into the street. He walked with quick steps as far as Laleli. Here he turned right and walked towards Sheikh-Zadebashi through a broken street passing between burnt areas and scattered houses. Nihat, remaining in the tavern, asked the journalist beside him in alarm, "Hey, wasn't tonight's bill on you?" The other, struggling to raise his heavy eyelids and head, nodded yes. After taking a deep breath, Nihat murmured, "Then why did our crazy boy run off?" 7. When he knocked on Aunt Amin's door, it was nearly midnight. All the rooms of the house facing the street were dark. Only a faint light came through the glass panel above the door. "There must be people sitting in the hall," he said. Visiting these relatives whom he hadn't called on perhaps for a year at such an inconvenient hour didn't seem at all strange to him. Since the old days, even when he was attending high school, whenever he stayed out too late to return to school, he would come here, sleep a comfortable sleep recalling his childhood in a bed the old servant Fatma made up in one of the empty rooms, and in the morning usually leave without being seen by anyone. This time he had made the decision to come here suddenly. What was being talked about in the tavern seemed inexpressibly empty and cold to him. He felt the desire to go to an environment completely separate from this world, more natural, closer to the earth. He knew that his aunt's new Riche house wasn't the place he was looking for, but he didn't want to admit even to himself the real reason that drew him here. Fatma opened the door as usual. The old spinster who had borne the burden of this house for 30 years stood before him with her kitchen-smelling clothes and her always smiling eyes.
The sincere joy she felt at seeing Omer was evident in her every manner. "Come in, young master. They haven't gone to bed yet," she said. Then, making way, "Don't ask. Things are bad this evening, but let them tell you themselves. Come in." When Omer climbed a few steps, he found Uncle Galip and Aunt Amin in the oilcloth-floored hall. Galip Effendi, straightening up from where he had been dozing, was trying to greet the guest with a smiling face. Aunt Amin, with her white headscarf and reddened eyes, was moaning, "Come, come, dear Omer, don't ask what's happened to us." Omer immediately understood the matter. "Did you tell her?" he said. We told her. Besides, even if we hadn't told her, she was beginning to understand. This evening she threw her arms around my neck. "I'm a big girl. Why do you hide things from me?" she said. "Leaving me in suspense like this upsets me more. For God's sake, tell me whatever it is," she said. She made me swear, and I let it slip. You should have seen the girl who said she'd control herself. Heart-rending. She threw herself on the cushions, screaming. Then, without even listening to our consolation, she ran away, went upstairs to her room, locked the door behind her. She turned off the light. A little later, her voice stopped too. Omer asked in alarm, "Didn't you go to her room and look in on her?" "Of course we did, but as I said, she locked the door. Goodness, I was in a panic. I was scared to death, thinking maybe she'd do herself harm. I pounded on the door. 'Auntie dear, leave me in peace. Let me rest my head a bit. Let me sleep,' she said. I don't know, she's a strange girl. At such painful times, a person looks for someone to share her troubles, but she looks for a place to escape to." She passed her hand over her eyes, which were tearing up again. "My nerves are on edge too. My head's been splitting since then. After all, it's a father's death. But what can you do?" Galip Effendi murmured, "The deceased's situation was also quite bad." Aunt Amin shot him a look, showing she was angry that he thought about the situation even at such a time of mourning. At that moment, Omer felt he was truly sorry for the poor girl. He remembered his own father, who had died 4 years ago. His life spent in Istanbul at boarding schools had prevented him from really knowing his father.
Although he had gotten used to looking at him as someone who sent him money from month to month and whose home he went to during vacations, the news of his death had really shaken him. A person felt a lack, a nakedness, as if one of the walls of the room he was sitting in had suddenly disappeared. He didn't want to believe that something that until the day before had existed as naturally as our arm or a leg had suddenly become nothing. Omer said with a thoughtful air, if only her education didn't remain unfinished. Uncle Galip, starting up from his sleep, immediately answered, let's see if their situation will permit. Aunt Amine repeated her look of a moment ago and thought once more how her husband's old philandering and the open-handed generosity befitting a provincial notable had been erased over time and replaced by a meaningless stinginess. If Amin Hanoum weren't there, not even a morsel of food would be offered to the guests and townspeople who came to the house. But she was pushing this terrible moment back a little further with all her strength, all her will, saying, I'll cough up blood and say I ate cornelian cherries. Rather than fail in hospitality to a guest, we'll fast as a household, that's better. However, there was yet no fasting as a household. The raki he had drunk on an empty stomach had given Omer a strange heaviness. He yawned several times. Fatma, who was sitting on her knees in a corner, leapt up. Your bed is ready upstairs, young master. Omer, trying to stretch, said, I'll go then, and got up. Aunt Amine said with a reproachful air, don't you dare leave again without being seen by us. This time I'll be offended. God give you rest. Omer climbed the wooden, creaking staircase and entered the small room facing the street. A large mattress spread on the floor covered the middle of the room. He looked for the switch to turn on the light, then gave up. The street lamp burning right in front of the window lit up the room completely. He sank on a chair near the door. His head was beginning to ache, and inside him there was a causeless sadness. He let his eyes wander around. Almost nothing had changed in this room he had known since the old days. A cheap but excessively fancy room set, consisting of a sofa with collapsed springs and 4 creaking chairs, still held its old place. On the floor was the same old but beautiful ushak rug. On the divan by the window, the same calico covers and straw pillows. On the wall, the same Bismillah plaque, and in a corner, on a small table, the same portable gramophone with records in torn sleeves. Omer felt even more oppressed amid this jumbled furniture. Then he thought of his aunt, who, despite her sorrow, hadn't forgotten her Cole and Rudge, and his plump cousin Samiha, who was surely now sleeping a carefree sleep in her room, and was amazed at how well they fit here. They too, like this room, like their whole house, hadn't yet found where they belonged. Inside them too, the Bismillah plaque and the Sonia record stood side by side. Getting up from the chair where he sat, he went to the window and opened the pane. It was a cool spring night. He hoped the cold air coming in would help his headache. In the sky, reddened by the city lights, scattered clouds were racing. From a few streets away came the screech of tram wheels. When he turned his eyes across the way, he saw that the high walls surrounding a large mansion's garden, which had been there for years, still rose in the same place unchanged, and he was astonished.
Everything in his life changed so quickly that when, after some time had passed, he saw objects still in the same state, it surprised and saddened him. The thoughts inside his head were in constant motion, shapeless and too scattered to grasp, just like those sparse clouds in the sky. But gradually they gathered themselves more. They continued to chase each other in the form of various memories, desires, passions, hopes. At this point, he noticed he was saying things to himself. Despite all his effort, he couldn't remember what he was saying. A center not subject to his will was working in his head, and when he tried to turn his attention there, it immediately disappeared into the mists. He rested his head on the windowsill. His eyes were half closed. The branches of a few trees in the opposite mansion's garden, reaching over the wall, were swaying in the night, with soft movements like smoke rising from a chimney. For a moment, he felt himself drifting away from the tram noises, from the electric light, from the night, toward a green and bright place. He was walking among poplar saplings on a narrow path. On his right, foamy water was flowing in a channel a step wide. On his left, there was a gentle ridge extending downward, and on it, vineyards surrounded by hedges of blackberry and wild rose. He saw very clearly the stumps standing like crouched people, and the cherry saplings with their red fruit on them. After a while, the path came to a short slope. Now the trees and bushes on both sides had become so thick and high they hid the surroundings. At the top of the slope, there was a fairly wide clearing. Large walnut and elm trees completely covered the sky, and the light filtering through the leaves was decorating a small pool at one edge of the clearing with a constantly changing mosaic. So the water flowing from the edge of the path he had come on originated here. He walked in that direction. The pool disappeared under mossy, ivy-covered rocks. Around, there was no sound but the rustle of the leaves and the sweet splashing of the water bubbles rising from the bottom of the pool through the sand. The shrill cry of a tram wheel made him start. In an instant, he began to burn with a terrible curiosity. Where had he seen this landscape, this green path, and this water springing from among rocks and forming a natural pool? He gathered all his memory. He tried to bring before his eyes the places he had visited since childhood, the beautiful landscapes that had settled in his mind. He couldn't remember this place at all. Where was it? He searched everywhere, from the Dorsen Bay forests to the Kasda pine groves and springs. He thought of the places he had traveled by carriage and on foot. Was he alone on this tree-laned path, or were others with him? He couldn't remember this either. He racked his brain till it nearly cracked. The places that came to life before his eyes with so much detail were not a fantasy. He knew he had certainly seen these places, but when? "I wonder if I saw them in one of my dreams," he said. No, this was no dream or anything. He had passed along that path. He had seen the cherry trees and vineyard stumps with his eyes. Inside him, a tremendous desire to see that place again, but not being able to remember where it was, he was writhing in helplessness. This failure had annoyed him. He turned his eyes back to the room. This often happened to him. While reading a book, he would seem to recognize a few lines there, but he couldn't remember where or how he had learned them. Or while saying something to someone, a place inside his head would whisper to him that he had had this same conversation with the same people and the same words at another time, and Omer, forgetting what he was saying, would start to investigate this. Several times he had wanted to think he had seen these things in his dreams. Perhaps some strange power was showing him some events in dreams beforehand. Then he found this thought ridiculous. But it was also certain that certain events, certain things he was doing for the first time in his life, certain words he had said or heard were not foreign to him. He knew he had done or seen or heard these things at a time he couldn't determine, but certainly at some time. He rested his head wearily on the calico-covered straw pillow. Inside the house, it was quiet. Closing his eyes, in his imagination, he toured all the rooms. Fatma surely had spread her mattress on the oilcloth-floored hall downstairs and sunk into that light sleep of hers. One of her feet, with their cracked heels, had come out from under the edge of the blanket. She had clasped her hands, grown big from work, over her breasts that had shrunk and withered without anyone touching them. Her black hair, escaping from her dirty kerchief, had scattered on the pillow. Her chest was rising and falling calmly, and her mind, which had forgotten how to think, was perhaps trying not to lose entirely the ability to function by being occupied with dreams about her mother and father whom she hadn't seen since the age of 7. It wasn't very pleasant to imagine the way Uncle Ghalib and Aunt Emin, sleeping in the room overlooking the garden on the lower floor, were lying. Their bodies, two huge masses of fat sinking the mattress, had turned their backs to each other. Uncle Ghalib's white embroidered front nightgown had gathered at his waist, and a part of his flannel trousers with mother-of-pearl buttons had slipped up to his knee. Aunt Emin was sleeping with faint drops of sweat appearing in the folds of her neck and coal and sleep crust overflowing from the corners of her eyes. Both were having troubled dreams. Uncle Ghalib's snoring was mixing with a whistle coming from her wife's lips or nose, it wasn't clear which.
Upstairs, in a room also overlooking the garden, Samiha was lying with her plump but young body. She had spread her light brown, straight hair on the embroidered pillow and put one hand under her cheek, the other on her chest.
Her white, chubby legs, stretched out and apart, were wrapped in the calico sheets. Perhaps dreams of husbands with automobiles, silk presses, having her hair curled somewhere, were passing through her carefree head. And in the room right beside Ömer hadn't wanted to admit to himself that this imaginary tour he had made of all the rooms of the house was solely to arrive here. But now he understood. This was also the reason he had gotten up from the tavern and come here at midnight. The things he had felt that morning on the ferry when he first saw the girl passed through his mind once more. "Stupid Nihat, he'll nearly turn me into something different from what I am," he muttered. Until then, he had accustomed himself to a kind of pride and pleasure in openly pouring out everything that passed through his mind and heart. This seemed to him an expression of his self-confidence. He thought there was no reason to act differently this time either. What was her name? Majid. Yes, Majid, he said. Not a very pretty name, really. Her father probably heard it from a clerk's child and gave this name to his daughter. Whatever it is, despite her name, if I see her tomorrow, I'll tell her I'm madly in love with her. He tried to bring Majid to life in his imagination. He couldn't quite find her face. He only remembered how, when they parted from each other so she could get on the tram, she had walked away with such a sweet gait without once looking back, and also her extraordinarily beautiful neck, which showed only about 2 fingers' width between her black curly hair and her slender shoulders. What color were her eyes? It was certain she had a striking complexion and chin, but what was the shape of her mouth and teeth? Whatever they're like, a creature the like of whom I've never seen in my whole life. Tomorrow. When it occurred to him that while he was occupied with such selfish imaginings, the poor girl was who knows in what state, he was ashamed. Perhaps she had undressed and stretched out on her bed, or perhaps she was sitting hunched in a corner of the room with her clothes on. But she was surely awake. Perhaps at this moment her eyes were fixed on the same cloud racing across the sky. Who knows how the young girl's heart was beating, wrenching inside her chest? It was a sad thing for an 18-year-old girl in the house of such relatives whose souls were more distant than strangers to be wide awake alone in a dark room at midnight and trying to struggle with the painful truth she had learned 2 hours ago. Ömer knew how at such times a person grows stupid and looks for someone around to pour their troubles to. "Tomorrow I'll try to console her," he said. But when he saw how base he had become at that moment, he screwed up his face. He began to struggle with his mind, which wanted to build fantasies about how he would open his heart to her, how she would give sweet and favorable answers. His experiences until now had taught him that the events he kept alive in his imagination never came to pass. He found the reason for this not in the grandness and impossibility of his aspirations, but in fate's hostile game. So this time he wanted to think nothing. He was sure that if he imagined how favorably the girl would treat him, tomorrow he would certainly encounter the opposite. But this time, contrary to usual, he was attaching importance not to his fantasies, but to reality, to the position the girl would actually take tomorrow. He wanted to resort to the trick of thinking negative things now in order to ensure that this would be positive. But his brain, tired from running in all directions for hours and still retaining the effect of the Rocky, gradually grew foggy, and Ömer fell asleep in front of the open window, his head on the straw pillows. Chapter 8. He woke before it was light. A faint whiteness had begun behind the trees in the garden of the mansion across the way. He moved his body. His neck ached a little. That, too, was from lying uncomfortably on the pillow. The coolness of the night hadn't affected his young muscles. Only on his face and hands there was an unpleasant dampness. He wiped with his handkerchief this wet layer which he didn't know came from his skin's secretions during sleep or from the humidity of the air.
With the same handkerchief, he also cleaned his glasses at length. He didn't want to go to the tap and make noise while everyone was asleep. Leaving where he sat wasn't pleasant either. In the garden across the way, a lot of birds whose species he couldn't tell were chirping away. The trees, whose leaves were still tiny, were stirring under the influence of a sweet breeze and making a barely audible sound. Watching the stars in the sky go out one by one was an extraordinarily beautiful thing. To see how the dirty, mossy tiles came to life under the ever-increasing light and seemed to move, how a tool-like vapor rising from the trees and roofs melted and disappeared in this brightness, gave a person courage. Omer murmured, "This world that has a season like spring is worth living on, whatever happens." Gradually, movement began in the streets.
The terrible screeching of the first trams spread in waves all around. From the gardens of several houses came the sounds of wooden clogs and pumps. The window of one of the houses a little farther along the street, one that still had lattices, was noisily pushed up. An automobile passed, grumbling, and turned onto the tram avenue. Omer thought that not only these relatives of his, not only their house, but this city too was a patched-up thing. Nature and technology, 100 years ago and today, were going nose to nose. The beautiful and the artificial, the necessary and the pretentious, were living rubbing against each other. Meanwhile, there were footsteps in the hall on the lower floor. Fatma had surely gotten up and was preparing the breakfast table. Omer went to the mirror, straightened his necktie and his hair. He wanted to wait a bit longer before going to wet his face at the tap and drink his fill of water. Sounds were heard from the next room. The door opened. Omer immediately leapt from his place. Without thinking anything, he quickly went out into the hall. Majide, towel in hand, had gone into the toilet area with the tap. Through the half-open door, her white nightgown and disheveled hair could be seen. Omer immediately said, "So she did undress and go to bed." As if sleeping in her clothes until morning was required for mourning, he found this a bit strange. Majide had washed her face and was coming out drying it. Omer looked around in confusion and began to twist and wave the small pink towel that had been left on the back of the chair beside his door. The young girl, raising her head, first studied the person before her as if she didn't recognize him, then in a very indifferent manner, "Is it you? Good morning," she said. Omer was hitting his right knee with the towel he had folded in two. With excitement like a small child, "Yes, it's me. I came late. You were asleep. That is, you had retired early. I didn't see you. I hope you're well. My condolences," he said. Seeing that Majide was making a movement to go, he was talking hurriedly, wanting to keep her there a while longer. It was certain that the young girl had spent the night sleepless. Her eyes were swollen and red, her face deathly pale and worn. Omer saw that in thinking she had gone to bed and slept, he had been a bit unfair. At the same time, he was surveying the person before him from head to toe. Wearing a long white nightgown, Majide looked longer and slenderer. Her foot, about 4 fingers wide, visible between her red velvet slipper and the hem of her nightgown, was ivory white, smooth and motionless. Her arms, too, bursting from among the folds covering her shoulders and extending down her sides, were motionless and white. On the back of the hand holding the towel, there were thin, barely visible blue veins spreading fan-like from her wrist toward her fingers. Her short curly hair had been pushed behind her ears, and its wet parts were gleaming here and there. Omer couldn't find anything else to say. The girl standing before him in her night-clothes, but without any embarrassment and without showing any unnatural haste, and her looking at him with bold eyes completely bewildered him. If Majide had rushed with artificial excitement and tried to run away covering this and that, Omer might have made commonplace jokes beginning with, "Well now, young lady," and become brazen. But the person before him was more natural than he, that is, stronger. Omer swallowed once and said, "Yes, I was very sorry. My condolences."
Majide, again with the same indifferent manner, but not at all impolitely, said, "Thank you," and went into her room. Omer, too, turned to go into his own room, but then thinking how ridiculous it would be to go out, he went to the tap, took his glasses in one hand, wet his face a little with the other, and dried it on the towel twisted in his palm like a turban. Although his mouth was completely dry, he had forgotten to drink water. He stood for a while in his room. Inside him there was a part that believed he had made everything worse, that he had cut a ridiculous and pitiable figure before the young girl. Pooh, damn it, what an idiot I've become. I must have looked at the girl as if I'd eat her. She didn't show it, but she's certainly terribly annoyed. If I were a girl, I'd loathe men of my type, he muttered. He couldn't go and sit on the divan. If he wanted to pace up and down in the small room, he thought this would prove his agitation and might be heard from the next room. He stood indecisively in the middle. Life is really full of pettiness and vulgarity, not worth living, he murmured. Then, saying, "Oh, never mind," he turned back, went out, and descended the stairs to the lower floor, to the hall. The table with the white oilcloth cover was set. Fatma came from the garden side, drying her wet hands one by one on her sides.
In the enamel bowl in one hand there were large green olives. She put this on the table beside the plate of honeycomb and said, "You sit down, sir. Our people get up late." Omer thought that today, too, he would leave without seeing the household, but that they wouldn't be offended this time either. Only he asked, "Has my uncle-in-law left?" "No, he hasn't gotten up yet." So Ghalib Effendi, too, had finally let go of business. He, too, had finally understood that there was no benefit in going to the shop at Ya Iskalesi before the morning prayer, and trusting in the honesty of his 16-year-old apprentice, he had found it wiser to catch a morning nap. He pulled up a chair and sat down. Fatma was pouring tea into the white glass cup before him. The door of the room upstairs opened. There were footsteps in the hall. Omer said in a voice trying to be indifferent, "That must be Samiha." "It won't be, it won't be. The young lady doesn't get up before noon. It must be Majida Hanum. It's school time. She didn't go yesterday. They were at a friend's in Kadikoy. But how will she go today?" The footsteps upstairs continued. Majida was probably busy putting on her shoes. Fatma sidled up to Omer and whispered in his ear, "That school is a place with instruments and songs, they say. Should one go on such a day?" Then, shaking her head, she added, "But what's she to do? Shut up here? Maybe she'll get some air and feel better. I feel so sorry for the poor girl." Majida began to come down the stairs. She was wearing a green-checked, brick-colored sports skirt and a brown wool sweater. On her head was a beret of the same color. Omer's eyes turned to her. Something like a smile creased his face. Majida, too, was coming with a sweet smile on her face. In the dim hall, the redness of her eyes and the pallor of her face weren't very noticeable. She only looked a bit languid. Omer found her smile extraordinarily sad. Not because he thought it wasn't right to smile at such times. One would have to be blind not to notice how much Majida was suffering. But this strange young girl was a creature so self-confident that she didn't even want to show her sorrow to those around her. The rather successful smile on her lips seemed to push away those who wanted to approach her. Omer said to himself, "I'm about to get myself into a big thing. Hope it ends well." Majida went and stood right across from Omer. Taking her cup, she drank a few sips. She didn't want anything, but she was trying to finish her hot tea so as not to do anything out of the ordinary. At one point her eyes met Omer's. The young man with light brown hair falling on his white forehead seemed to him a bit ridiculous but very sincere. Majida's face, too, was enveloped by a warm air coming from within, and closing her eyelids slightly, she sighed. At that moment her whole posture seemed to say, "You see my state." Omer immediately understood this. Looking at the person across from him with fixed eyes, he took a deep breath. Like two people sitting in a compartment who don't know each other's language, they were trying to understand each other with slow, hesitant smiles. Several times Omer opened his mouth and leaned forward. He seemed about to say something. Then he gave up. Majida appeared not to have noticed this.
Finally, both of them stood up at the same time. Omer said to Fatma, "Give my regards to my aunt and uncle. Look, I waited, but they still haven't gotten up. The fault is off me." Then, smiling, he added, "And kiss Samiha's eyes for me." He took his hat. Majida, too, had taken her sheet music and put on her light-colored overcoat. Omer asked in an important manner, "Are you going out too?" "Yes, as you see." Omer thought, one can't do tricks in front of this girl. Knowing methods, the pleasant impudities that impressed girl classmates, even the flirtatious jokes that sometimes verged on shamelessness, lay in his head like dead objects. On the other hand, his desires were incomparably more intense than anything he had felt before. Majida's fingers touching his hand as they went out the door had made Omer turn crimson. As her sorrowful eyes, trying to maintain that proud smile under their long black lashes, moved over the young man, they completely bewildered him and drove him to look around meaninglessly and fall silent. From time to time, Omer's eyes, too, surveyed the person beside him, and as her bosom, visible under the brown sweater, seemed to be trying to burst out of the unbuttoned overcoat, the young man would clench his teeth and breathe rapidly. When they came to the tram avenue, they looked at each other.
Omer immediately asked, "Where are you going? To the conservatory? It's only 8 o'clock. I still have an hour. Let's walk if you like." Majide nodded yes and continued on her way. They came to Bayazit, then toward the coppersmiths' district. The same unease continued in both of them. Omer began to mutter to himself, "My tongue is tied like a nightingale that's eaten mulberries, a state I'm noticing in myself for the first time. However, the situation is strange, too. One can't just declare love to a girl in mourning whom one has just met and who only yesterday heard of her father's death. One can only offer condolences, the one thing I've never done in my life. No one should console me, nor should I console anyone. Hypocrisy reaches its limit in consolation. The false expression of sorrow that faces assume at such moments, those eyebrows that rise a little and come together, that head shaking gently with an understanding air, that mournful voice that one tries to bring up from deep down, drives a person mad. I'm sure this girl thinks exactly as I do. She certainly won't like such things. You can tell from the way she just got up and went to school as if nothing had happened. But what the hell should I do? It's not very sensible either to look and size each other up like two middle school students whose mouths smell of milk. That's another kind of coldness. What if I just reach out my hand and say goodbye and run off? I can't stand this much discomfort. But why can't I do it? There's certainly something binding me to her here. Her profile is marvelous. What a white face she has. A bit yellowish. Is it from sleeplessness, or is it always like this? I certainly know this girl. I mean, I know her soul. There's something between us. Ah, that stupid Nihat. He'll drive me mad one day. You probably saw her when you were a child. A memory remained in your mind. You're exaggerating it, he was saying. That's a lie. This isn't some childhood memory or something. But he once put it that way. He raised such a possibility. I can't save myself. It's impossible. How keen people are on simplifying, vulgarizing events. A stupid remark ruins all my fantasies. I don't like Nihat much these last days anyway. He's getting into dark dealings. But he's a good friend. He'd even risk his life for me. But how do I know? That's just my notion. Maybe he wouldn't even trim his fingernail. However, in our friendship until now, it was always he who had to make the sacrifices. Material sacrifices. Let's see if he can go further. He doesn't absorb me as much as before. All the fellows around him are the same, only it's also certain they have a strange attraction, the feverish working like a machine of a lot of brains, good or bad, to show something holds a person. His eyes fell on Majide again. She too had sunk into some thoughts. Her brows were knit, her eyes fixed ahead. She was walking without a single line of her face moving. The several volumes of sheet music she held under her right arm had slipped backwards.
Her low-heeled brown pumps were skipping skillfully on the pavements. Omer noticed that she took large free strides like a man. The way many girls walked hopping with tiny steps always aroused in him a strange feeling of pity, so he began to appreciate Majide's keeping pace with him. They had come to the bridge. There was a crowd walking as if running, and a hum of voices came from all sides. They crossed to the sidewalk on the Golden Horn side. From time to time, they looked at the yellow waters, at the boats and barges large and small. A boy of about 10 had sat down in a corner of one of the pontoons. Taking worms from the tin box he had put beside him, he was attaching them to the line, casting out a little way, then pulling in with regular strokes. They watched him for a while. The perseverance and will of the boy, who was dangling his bare, dirty feet from the pontoon and not taking his eyes off his fishing line, made Omer think. He thought he could never grasp any task with such attention and such devotion. Just then, one of Majide's sheet music fell to the ground. Omer immediately bent down and picked it up. Extending his hand, he said, "Give them to me. I'll carry the others too." Majide handed them without making a sound. Only something like gratitude moved in her eyes. This manner of hers was binding Omer all the more. He said to himself, "What a strange thing. Many great compliments and permissions from many girls I was crazy about don't make me as happy as a glance from this girl whose meaning I can't even quite understand. Yes, just a glance, and perhaps mixed with a bit of pity, but the fact that it's at least not an indifferent glance makes me jump out of my seat. I feel a tremendous lightness and expansiveness inside me. Perhaps this is really what love is. Perhaps until now I didn't know what really loving was. I wonder if I should let myself go. Every time I resort to my will, I feel a great fatigue. Should I give myself over to the hands of events? I wonder what she's thinking right now. Certainly not of me. Why not? What wouldn't I give to live for a while in her head? Everything. Let her give me a sign, and immediately, without a moment's thought, I'll throw myself under that tram. I wonder if I would throw myself." Majide grabbed Omer's arm, saying, "What's the matter with you?" The young man was looking around, bewildered. Majide asked, "Did you see someone across the way? But you were about to get under the tram." Omer looked at where he was. He wasn't on the pedestrian sidewalk, so he had passed in front of Majide and come here? He collected himself. "I thought I recognized someone. It was nobody." On his left arm, where Majide had held it tightly a moment ago, he felt a strange shiver. "Why isn't she holding it? Why did she let go?" he murmured. His face was screwed up like a child. Inside, there was a need to cry that he restrained with difficulty. Finally, he couldn't bear it. "Why don't you take my arm?" Majide took his arm at the same place she had held it a moment ago, but this time more lightly. At this moment, their eyes met. Majide looked long, as if trying to remember something. It flashed quickly through Omer's mind that she had studied him in exactly this way yesterday on the bridge, too. As Majide's eyes remained on him, he was becoming confused. The young girl seemed to be seeing things, placing them in her mind, then starting to look for new things. Omer turned his head. They began to walk again and climbed the hill after Karakoy without speaking. They noticed that every passing second was making a change inside them, making them know each other better.
Each was following a path in their own mind and knew for certain that a parallel of this path existed in the mind of the person beside them. When they came in front of the conservatory, Majide silently extended her hand. Omer was astonished. Now it was possible to part from her and not see her for weeks. That was the natural thing, but his mind couldn't accept being separated from her, even for 5 minutes. He was afraid to say what he was thinking. He could only say, "How will you be able to work now?" Majide, with that incomprehensible smile, "Why do you ask? Should such things be asked?" she said. Omer, gathering all his courage and will, murmured, "I was going to tell you many things." "You didn't say anything."
Omer looked at her with reproachful eyes. Machide, in a voice as if asking pardon, "We'll see each other again," she said. The one across from her immediately sprang. "When?" Machide shrugged her shoulders. "Shall I come and pick you up from here this evening? We'll go to my aunt's together." The young girl seemed to think, then making her decision. "As you wish," she said, and climbed the stone steps. Omer was going down the hill almost at a run. He was light as a feather. Inside him there was a happiness bubbling over. He wanted to embrace the people passing by, to say to everyone, "Come on, what are you standing around for? Laugh, be happy. Is there anything as sweet as life?" He went down to the bridge in one breath. His heart was pounding tremendously. He looked at his watch. It was nearly 10. "I'm late again," he thought. But this didn't spoil his good spirits. There was a distant relative who had gotten him his job at the post office and who held a rather important position there. "Let me go kiss his hand. He'll be pleased, and when the people in our department see me coming out of his room, they'll hold their tongues," he thought to himself. He didn't even know the name of the job for which he received 42 liras and 75 kurush a month. He sat in accounting and did almost nothing. From time to time, the cashier, Hafiz Husamaddin Effendi, would call him to help and ask him to write meaningless numbers in various meaningless ledgers. This didn't seem boring to him at all. He would invent methods for himself, find shortcuts. Sometimes he would write first the ones column, then the tens, then the other columns, one under another. After reading 10 or 15 numbers, he would test how many he could write without forgetting, and he took pleasure in these, as if he were giving his mind a kind of workout. There were perhaps 10 desks in the room where he worked. None of the clerks of various ages sitting behind each of these, working silently as if engrossed in important business, was more devoted to his duty than Omer. One was thinking about making a living, another about his rendezvous, another about films, and cursing non-stop at this boring job he endured for the sake of bread money. Every side of the small desks, with their ink-stained surfaces, were filled with huge black ledgers, lined papers, documents pinned together. Besides this, on the shelves behind 2 clerks who sat at somewhat larger desks, the same black large ledgers stood. A young clerk had lifted the corner of the blotter from in front of him, and looking at the round pocket mirror he had stuck there, was adjusting his brilliantined hair and his worn artificial silk necktie. Because the edges of his vest didn't cover the tears and patches near the collar of his European-style shirt, his hand kept going nervously to his neck. The trousers of his light-colored suit, whose knees were beginning to get dirty, were very sharply pressed. On the toe part of his canary-yellow shoes, which were probably wearing their 3rd sole, there were sweat stains in the creases. Beside him, another clerk, middle-aged and with his hair cut like a brush, had opened the drawer on the right side of his desk and, bending into it, was reading the historical novel from an old evening newspaper. The occupants of the other desks, too, although they had official work before them, were trying to find a hole in some corner and escape to their personal, private lives. At the very least, after writing 2 or 3 lines or doing a calculation, they would lean back in their chairs and throw their heads back, sinking into long thoughts. Their standing for a while like this, then shaking as if prodded by someone, and bending over their desks pretending to be busy with their work, reminded Omer of the mill horses that from time to time stop and raise their heads and try to sense something behind their blindfolded eyes, then set about turning again. The cashier, Hafiz Husamaddin Effendi, who worked in a small room right beside them, behind a cage with brass bars, was perhaps the only man in the office who did any work. Sometimes he would stay in his room even after everyone had left. He would make separate entries in 5 or 6 different ledgers, lock his safe with 3 or 4 different keys, and talk to very few people. In his first days here, Omer had become friends with him.
He had immediately understood that this man, who always went around with his beard a bit grown, who looked like 60 with his half-gray, half-fallen-out hair although he wasn't even 45 yet, was not at all a simple person. He made jokes peculiar to himself and knew, When speaking of those around him, he gave judgments that were a bit sharp but apt. Omer had never been able to figure out how, although he rarely came to the big room, he knew the peculiarities of all the clerks there. Usually he was in good spirits. He would work with thin silver-rimmed glasses and raise them to his forehead when he was going to talk to someone. His light hazel eyes, which always seemed to be smiling, took a person in the palm of their hand and never let go. All his movements and words were open and unambiguous, like a man who had no worries and was afraid of nothing. Yet Omer knew that he was not at all living in clover. He had 5 children, the oldest 18, and also a wife. He was one of those who could barely make it to the beginning of the month on the salary he received. In their first days of acquaintance, Omer had begun to complain about his situation to him, saying that the money he received was useless, that the few liras that came once in a blue moon from his mother in Balıkesir weren't enough even to buy material for a suit, that once he finished his studies, things would certainly be different, but that because of lack of money he had been attending the faculty uselessly for 6 years. But his lack of attendance at class and his still not having finished school weren't because of lack of money or anything. Inside him there was an unconquerable distrust, a causeless indifference toward what was taught, and especially toward those who taught it. However much he tried to look for the reasons outside himself, he knew that the real cause was in his own strange head. To deceive himself before anyone else, he was making up such tales to anyone who came along. Hafiz Effendi, after listening to him with a serious face, said, "My boy, we've been through your years. Once a person has started learning, he shouldn't let go of it. The moment a little coldness sets in, this thing called learning, the scoundrel, scares a person off. Too much familiarity with life after a certain age keeps people from learning many things, that is, from learning in the proper way. From now on, don't tire yourself in vain. Choose another path in your life. Look to getting into a bank or something. You're young. You'll succeed." After thinking for a while, as if sunk in memories, he had begun to talk about himself. "I, too, left my studies halfway, like you, not from the university or anything, but from the last years of high school, and took a post with my father, who was a treasurer. I married young. 4 or 5 years later, my father died, and after him my wife. I suddenly let myself go. I quickly squandered the few kurush my father had left. Then we latched on to another post, married again, got mixed up with wife and children. We're being dragged along. What else is life anyway? I believe in this. So as not to poison our 3.5 days of life, we should shut ourselves up in today and live, paying no attention either to our past life and the opportunities we missed, or to the impossible dreams of the future. Every event has a side that can amuse a person. At the beginning of the month, when the grocer isn't satisfied with the money we give him and turns up at the doorway, our wife has nervous fits. But I find pleasant sides even in that. I watch how the grocer furiously takes off his cap and puts it on again in the doorway, how his tongue, which he tries to adapt to the Istanbul dialect, gets tangled and becomes unintelligible, and I sink into thoughts. Nothing in life is subject to our desire. Granted, this is a calamity, but creation has also given us a means to lighten this calamity, the ability to contemplate our surroundings with the eye of wisdom. Sometimes there's no money left for the children's books. The oldest insists, presses my throat, I have to give to him, but the other 4 are all girls, they can do nothing but cry. I sit them before me and preach about the uselessness of the thing called a book. Engrave your lessons in your minds, I say. Then, when I see them listening believingly to these words that even I don't seriously mean, I feel like both laughing and crying. It's the same in this office. Alongside a few cunning, knowing ones, there's also a flock of God's blessed sheep. They think they've done something important by living and occupying a 3-step space on earth. One is proud of his youth, another puffs himself up relying on his old age and inexperience. One boasts about what he used to be, another wants to gain esteem by hinting at what he'll become in the future. All of them together roll around in this mill whose nature they never understand, and they imagine that the axis of the universe passes through them. And some have become garrulous with old age. They keep chattering, like me. Omer took a strange pleasure in talking with him. They seemed to agree on believing in nothing. Only Hafiz Effendi, perhaps through the effect of the years he had lived, had also freed himself of the passions that filled Omer's inside in a shapeless way. He wanted nothing but the continuation of the present situation. From time to time, with a naturalness that astonished Omer, and without belittling himself or feeling crushed at all, he would ask the young man for a lira, and when Omer asked to borrow from him, he would take out whatever was in his pocket without even hesitating and give it. At such times, Omer would very often leave feeling as if he had taken the bread money of his wife and children. Today, too, after sitting at his desk for 10 or 15 minutes, Omer got up. He went to Hafiz's room. Inside him there was an irrepressible impatience. He was looking for someone to talk to about nothing in particular. But he saw that the cashier was extraordinarily busy. He had opened a huge ledger before him, lowered his glasses, and was frowning his brow as if struggling with calculations he couldn't get out of. When Omer turned to leave, he raised his head and called out, "Where are you going to eat? If you wait, let's go out together and go to a kebab shop. I'm bored today. We'll have a chat." Omer was surprised to hear from him words similar to what he would himself say. For Hafiz Effendi to say, "I'm bored," was something extraordinary. He returned to his desk. Since he had no book or newspaper to read, he opened a ledger before him and began to write and draw shapes and pictures on a piece of scrap paper printed on the back that he took from one of the drawers. Then, on another paper, he put various signatures and his own name listed one under the other. At one point, he signed Majide, one under another. Then, noticing that these signatures had happened to fall on top of the Omer's, not quite by accident, he crossed them all out. At the lunch break, he went and got the cashier. Contrary to his custom, this time Hafiz Effendi was silent. Going to a low-ceilinged kebab shop in the Bachkapi area, they ate a cheap meal. Several times, Omer looked at the face of the man across from him and wanted to ask something. Hüsamettin Effendi contented himself with pulling down both sides of his mouth and shaking his head. Then, paying for both of them, he got up.
They went into a small coffee house and leafed through a few newspapers. Although they had gone out with the intention of talking, both had sunk into their own worlds. Omer, thinking that the feeling of endless happiness and lightness inside him would finally come to a sad conclusion, and that fate was mocking him, wanted to make a kind of spiritual insurance by joining in the silence of the man beside him, whose cause he didn't know. The words he had heard around him since childhood, the people he had seen, had created in him the habit of being afraid of joy and happiness, of believing that these were something that brought bad luck. Words like "too much laughing ends in tears" had settled in his soul as unshakable convictions. Any pleasing event, as soon as the first tremors of joy passed, created a causeless fear and sadness, and Omer struggled to escape from this only through various ridiculous tricks. This time, too, without being aware of it, he had completely joined in the cashier's silence, had assumed a thoughtful air, had begun to feel bored. After taking a deep breath, "What's new, Hafiz Bey?" he said. "Don't ask, my boy. What's the matter? Have you too started caring about the world? This time there's no side that's a joke. We've gotten stuck in such an ugly business that may God make the end good," he said, and sank again into a long silence. Omer was looking at the face of the man across from him, expecting him to continue. But he, after being silent a while longer, slowly straightened up. "It's time. Let's go to the cell," he said.
Omer had been seized by a real curiosity, but knowing the other's nature, he didn't insist. Despite all his openness, the cashier didn't want anyone to stick their nose into his private affairs unless he himself brought them up. As they were climbing the office stairs, "My boy, in my eyes there's no difference between being young and being old. Perhaps old age, in having brought this meaningless drifting nearer to its end, is even better. But there are certain things, and it seems that old shoulders aren't enough to bear them. We'll see," he said. Then, suddenly returning to his old manner, "But I'm talking mysteriously, aren't I?" he said. "At some suitable time I'll explain the matter to you. I know you're not in any state to give me advice. Besides, it's not the kind of thing to be put right by advice. But a person feels like he's going to burst. Hide from the wife at home, hide from everyone at the office. One day I'll go crazy." Without saying anything else, he went into his room. Omer, too, came to his desk in the big hall, but he sensed he wasn't in any state to stay. Inside him there was an irrepressible impatience. He was muttering to himself, "We're both in the same city, and it takes less than half an hour to reach each other. Despite this, she's there and I'm here. Why? No reason. What am I doing here? What business do I have except boring myself and those around me? It's certain she's not occupied with anything very necessary there either. She's not going to sit and practice the piano on such a day. I wonder what in the world is as illogical and unnecessary as our not being side by side with her right now. Life is said to be a chain of coincidences. Fine, but coincidence too should have a logic of its own." So as not to be noticed, he left his hat where it was hanging and quietly went out. He bounded down the stairs. He hesitated a bit about which way to go. It was still early. "Let the girl not think I'm too eager," he said. He himself knew this idea was childish, that Majida wouldn't be fooled by such tricks. Besides, the thought that no game could be played in her presence was giving Omer both unease and calm. He was afraid of not being able to hide the disgraceful parts inside him. On the other hand, he was reassured thinking that the things he wouldn't have the courage to say she would understand by herself. To kill time, he walked towards the fish market. In the narrow streets, carts and porters were passing by, rubbing against each other. He was walking, trying to not lose his balance on the narrow pedestrian sidewalks that were muddy summer and winter alike. A little later, he came to Ya Iskanasi. The dark, flat-fronted stone buildings, with their half-open iron-winged windows, were so close together they seemed about to crush a person between them. In front of every shop there were dirty oil seepages extending towards the water channel at the edge of the street. A sticky smell enveloped one's nostrils, and from the nearby stagnant sea a foul, damp air spread into these streets. Omer recognized Uncle Ghalib's small shop. For some reason he had been accustomed since childhood to calling this brother-in-law Uncle. It couldn't be seen who was inside this establishment, consisting of a dark cellar. Only behind the dirty display window there were a few sample olive oil bottles, and near the door there was a huge barrel whose top had become slimy mud from dust mixed with oil. Omer thought, how can a whole life be imprisoned here, in this cellar? How can this road be walked without believing one will arrive at a better, brighter place? Yet Uncle Ghalib has seen other things. His childhood and youth also passed in sunny gardens, on wide, endlessly wide lands. Now he's stuffed in here like a rat, waiting. For what? For death. It's not even in our power to choose a beautiful place to wait for this terrible thing. The dimness of the street made him think it was very late. Turning back, he walked towards the bridge, and from there towards Baoli. It was still only 4 o'clock. When he came in front of the conservatory, he didn't know what to do. They had definitely fixed neither a time nor a place. Was he to wait in front of the door? Would he go in and ask? When? When classes were over? When did classes end? "I'm always upset because of little things like this," he said, taking up the habit of muttering to himself. My tongue wouldn't consent to say, like making an ordinary date, let's meet at such and such a place at such and such a time. Now I'm standing here strangely waiting and becoming a spectacle to those going in and out, whereas a person should tire his brain only to settle essential matters, and details should settle themselves, well on their own. If there were logic in life, this is how it would be. I wonder if there's anyone in the world who thinks about as many meaningless things as I do, and then we're not ashamed to pass ourselves off as clever. He decided to go in. After climbing the stairs, there came a rather wide corridor. Various instruments reached his ear. Groups of men and women were coming out with violin cases and sheet music in their hands. Omer approached one of them. "I'm looking for a student named Majida Hanım. Whom should I ask where she is?" he said. The girls looked at each other with a knowing smile. "Which Majida?" they asked, and after having him describe and explain at length, they said they didn't know her and walked away. Omer set about looking for an attendant somewhere around there, but at that moment the door of one of the rooms behind him opened, and he turned back as if someone were pulling him by the neck. The young girl came up to him with quick steps and said, "So you came up here. Did you search much? I thought I recognized your voice. I think you were asking for me." Omer looked into her eyes. With a courage whose source he didn't know, and without any hesitation, he asked, "You were waiting for me, weren't you?" After the young girl met his gaze for a while, she nodded with a distracted air. "Yes." She extended her hand to Omer. They stood like this for a while. Both their palms were cold as ice. From both their mouths at the same time came the word, "Let's go." They walked toward the stairs. Majida had taken Omer's arm at the same place she had held it that morning. Although she was a step behind, she wasn't letting go. In the street, they walked for a while without speaking. Afraid that the meaningless silence of the morning would begin, Omer murmured, "I was going to tell you something." "Yes?" She looked at Omer with eyes that didn't give much encouragement. The young man's light brown hair was falling completely onto his forehead, touching the edges of his glasses. In this state, he was as cute and meaningful as a small child. Behind the dirty lenses of his glasses, his small eyes, which seemed to have retreated deep, weren't moving at all. Majida turned her head and repeated, "Yes?" Omer, after a moment's hesitation, "Yesterday morning, when I was coming up to you on the ferry, I hadn't seen my aunt," he said. Majida looked at him, screwing up her eyes. She hadn't understood what he meant. Omer asked, "Shall I tell you everything? Don't mind my saying everything. It's not very long, only I definitely want to tell you. And now, if I leave it for another time, I'm afraid I won't find this courage. Why should I prolong this hesitation? You seem like an open person. I'm sure you won't play games with me. I have a feeling inside me that you'll understand me at this moment. However childish, however commonplace my words may be, you'll sense that I don't mean commonplace things." He couldn't finish. Majida looked at his plumpish cheeks, his sweaty lips. The young man's somewhat thick, light brown eyebrows had scattered towards his forehead and mingled with his hair. He had a feverish looks, as if the reflection of certain strings vibrating intensely inside him had struck his eyes. The young girl understood how the person standing before her was burning to pour out what was inside him at that moment, and how far he was from every kind of lie. She felt the ice covering her soul against people was beginning, despite herself, to melt. The irresistible effect made on us by a person who spreads himself before us completely naked in every way had caught her too. Being side by side with someone who had cast off, even for a moment, his mask, his hidden purposes, and all his roles gave her courage and confidence. The things she had imprisoned inside herself, too, had begun to stir, wanting to burst out, to strike at last against a human ear. This new movement in her soul was giving birth to a sweet excitement and a clear gratitude toward the person who had caused it.
She was perhaps not curious about each thing Omer would say one by one, but she was impatient to watch him pour out, without hitting any obstacle, the things in his head and soul. "How openly you're speaking to me," she said. Before Omer, who couldn't understand what she meant by this, had a chance to ask something, Majida continued, "I think you're the first person who wants to speak openly with me, even just to speak with me. I feel inside that you can't say bad things to me. Why aren't you continuing?" Omer was opening his mouth and taking deep breaths, smiling, like a person who had escaped a great danger.
"Can I say bad things to you? Is it a bad thing to say that I love you? Madly, dying love you?" Don't be surprised. Probably your ears aren't used to such words, but only your ears. Even if you don't admit it to yourself, you'll confirm that your soul isn't a stranger to these words of mine. Look, you're not screaming. You're not running away from me. Your face doesn't express disgust. You understand me. To the end, to the smallest point, to its most hidden corner, you see my soul, and these things don't seem foreign to you, do they? I'm not asking you for an answer. I only want you to listen to me. I'm aware of what I'm doing in asking you to listen to a person you saw only yesterday and have talked to for a total of not even 2 hours, but a voice keeps whispering to me that I'm doing the right thing. Never in my life have I been this open. I hadn't been able to summon the courage, but now I feel such a great confidence that I would hand over my whole being to you with my eyes closed, and I'm speaking without being afraid that you'll mock me or reject me. This confidence, this conviction, came to me from the first moment I saw you. What did I say just now? When I was coming up to you on the ferry, I wasn't even aware that my aunt was sitting there. I had seen you, and after that I saw nothing else. I didn't know you. Despite this, with great confidence, I came up to you in that crowd. I was about to address you. My aunt joined in. There's no need even to tell all this. Besides, there's one thing I want to tell. One single thing I'm burning with the desire to say in 1,000 different forms. That I love you. I don't forget that this has been repeated how many billions of times since the formation of the world. But you tell me, has it lost any of its vitality? Isn't it as fresh and as ripe as no entity in the universe could be? This is such a word that it's born, and with its birth it brings also its perfection. I love you. What else should I say? Don't you try to answer either. What a tremendous thing it is for a person with his whole being, with his chaotic soul, his body whose mystery hasn't been solved, his desires, his habits, his passions, in short, with everything, to surrender to you, to join you. I know you completely understand this. I also know you can't remain indifferent to it. No person can be indifferent before a person who loves them. No one has the power of choice in the face of this most extraordinary event in the world. They have no right to it. Just as we don't have the power to say, "I don't want the air we need," or to give up occupying a place in space, so we don't have the ability not to take a love given to us. I love you, and how I love you, my God. If you cut a part of me right now, I wouldn't feel pain. When I want to do anything for you, I can't imagine a force that would stop me. Not even death is capable of it. Look, a lot of people are passing around us. Many of them keep turning and looking at us, or rather, at me. I'll catch whichever one you want and kill him. Even if he wants to resist, once he learns this is necessary for a love, his arms will limp up, his resistance will be broken. Look how you too are shaking, just like me. It's certain this is the first time in your life for such a thing. Tell me, is there any strangeness inside you? Weren't all these things known to you? Only at this moment a veil is being lifted in your head, and the richest parts of your soul are being spread before you. Without erring, I know that you too, like me, are not at this moment walking on broken sidewalks. You too are advancing freed from the 50 or 60 kilos of weight of your body. Look, we've come to Bayazit. How? In how much time? We don't know these things.
Don't you notice that time has stood still and is listening to us with awe? Give me your hand. Your pulse is beating as fast as mine, perhaps faster. The sweat on your wrist is burning my hand. I see the tiny heart under your beautiful breast. If we were to vanish at this moment, would you feel any sorrow? We don't want to leave life because we have many unsatisfied desires, but at this moment, no wish is binding us to the earth. Don't you feel that our souls are brimful? Your wrist is lying between my fingers with a surrender that drives a person mad. Your whole body is trembling like leaves on slender branches. I'm grateful to you for making me live this moment. I'm grateful to life, to chance, to those who brought me into the world, to everyone, to everything. Now we've come to your house. I won't go in. Until I see you again, I'll try to keep these moments alive in my mind. I don't know what I'll do. Perhaps I'll go outside the city and run until morning and come here with the dawn. Or perhaps I'll sit here at the foot of the wall and want to smell close by the air spreading from you all around. Go inside without saying anything to me. Every minute I'm with you carries me toward a greater happiness with dizzying speed. Now I'm afraid. Do you know what it is for happiness to be so much and so intense that it frightens us? Right now I'm afraid of collapsing right here. I'm afraid that the feelings accumulated inside me will suddenly explode and scatter me into particles. Goodbye. Tomorrow morning I'll come and get you again. Goodbye. Omer had sweated like a feverish patient. He caught Majida's hand and brought it toward his mouth, but without kissing it, he lowered it again. His eyes were on Majida's face. He had a distant look as if he didn't see the person before him. He waited like this for a moment, then suddenly turned around and walked away with quick steps and disappeared around the corner of the street. Majida slowly climbed the 2 steps and knocked on the door. She told Fatma she was tired and her stomach was full, that she would go straight to her room and lie down. Her small room facing the street was quite dim because it was beginning to get dark, and the lamp in front of the window hadn't been lit yet. After the young girl put the sheet music under her arm on a chair, she sat on the edge of her small white bed. Taking her face in her hands, she tried to think, or rather, to remember. Her pulse was still beating fast. Her head was still buzzing. Collecting herself, she wanted to think about Omer's words. Not a single word of them came to her mind. On the other hand, she kept seeing Omer, with his disheveled light brown hair, his eyes burning and shining like pieces of fire under his glasses, his mouth that became extraordinarily beautiful when he spoke, and his voice that spread through one's soul like harsh but sweet wind.